Tyranny of Steel. Chapters 326 to 343. Chapter 326 Near Effortless Victory. Days had passed since the company of Jaegers led by Captain Andreas reached the main force and informed Berengar of their troubles. Berengar had a long conversation with the female agent about her failed mission before dispatching her on another classified operation. Eventually, the Jaeger Corps returned with minimal losses from their operation. Having cleared the entire path forward, Berengar and his army marched onto the city of Milan, where they were now outside its gates. A siege camp was rapidly constructed in the same fashion that Berengar usually established. An extensive trench line was based around the encampment, surrounded by barbed wire. Embedded within this trench line were the cannons and Schmidt guns that bombarded the city and defended the camp. Observation towers were set up, with snipers atop them, giving the Austrian army a select view of their surroundings and the ability to react to any threat that might appear. The thousands of tents were used to house the soldiers and their supplies within the center of the trench line. Though the siege camp was established, Berengar had not yet ordered the bombardment of the city. Instead, he was within his command tent, overgoing the strategy of how the Austrians intended to take the city in the most efficient manner possible. Surrounding Berengar was his highest-ranking officers, each one commanding a large section of his forces. Among them was the colonel tasked with leading his elite Jaeger Corps, who, unlike the rest of the soldiers that were dressed in Renaissance-style armor and attire, was clad in relatively modern equipment. Spread out on the table before the officers and their king was a map of the city. Berengar had marked the various gatehouses in the town and had begun to address his general, who was tasked with leading the artillery brigades. "I want the cannons fixed on these gatehouses, I want the gates turned into splinters, and the entire gatehouse brought to ruin. Once the gatehouses have crumbled, our armies will charge into the city and slaughter any resistance they might come across." When the artillery general heard this, he saluted Berengar before responding to his strategy. "It will be done, Your Majesty." As Berengar heard this, he smiled before addressing the officer in charge of the infantry brigades. "After the artillery has brought down the gates, I need your men to penetrate the gaps as quickly as possible. I want this city picked clean by sunset. There is no reason to prolong this siege. The longer we stay here, the longer the enemy has time to prepare for our advance." The infantry general quickly responded to Berengar's concerns in the same manner as the artillery general. After doing so, Berengar began to address the colonel of the Jaeger Corps. "As for you, I want you and your soldiers to gather what supplies you need and prepare to move out at a moment's notice. I want the path towards Parma cleared before we even begin our march forward. We have spent far too much time already bogged down here in Milan." When the Jaeger colonel heard this, he nodded his head in response before uttering his acceptance of Berengar's terms. "Don't worry, Your Majesty, we Jaegers are the spearhead of the Royal Austrian Army. I promise you won't see a single skirmisher on your journey to Parma." As Berengar heard this, he smiled and nodded before dismissing his officers. "All right, you all know your plans, quickly set to the task. I want our troops prepared to move out before nightfall." When Berengar said this, all of the gathered officers quickly saluted him before responding in the affirmative. "Yes, Your Majesty." After saying this, they all exited the tent before preparing their troops for battle. As for Berengar, he pulled out a golden chalice and poured some fortified wine within it before taking a sip for himself. Thanks to his influence, the world was rapidly changing, and he knew it would not be long before his enemies began to adapt to his weapons. Sieges would not always be this easy, and as such, he had to savor the swift victories while still managing to achieve them. When he returned from this war, he desperately needed to begin the industrialization process of Austria. He had already advanced to the limits of pre-industrial society. If he wanted to maintain his dominance, the era of steel and steam would need to occur. As he was thinking about such things, the cannons began to echo in the distance as they unleashed their fury onto the gatehouses of the city of Milan. With his current prowess, Berengar estimated that at most it would take an hour before the city gates were brought to ruin and his soldiers could swarm the city like an army of locusts. As such, Berengar spent the remaining time of the bombardment within his command tent, overgoing his plans. The longer this war dragged out, the less beneficial it was for Berengar. He needed to quickly make his way to Bologna. However, there were several small cities in between, such as Parma, which he needed to pass through first. After doing so, he would head to Florence to capture the Medici's wealth and bring down the imperial crown. If things kept going as planned, this war would take at most last a few months. As Berengar was making these plans, an officer arrived within the tent, where he informed Berengar of their progress. "Your Majesty, the gates have crumbled, and our soldiers have begun to advance into the city." As Berengar heard this, he smiled before grabbing a hold of his burgonet and placing it upon his head. An army of roughly 50,000 men was rushing into the city and ransacking it for its worth. It would be a matter of hours before they began to depart. As such, Berengar intended to enjoy the sights and take a stroll through the city. With this in mind, he informed the officer of his decision. "Gather my guard. I will be entering the city." The officer nodded before departing from the tent. His guard was already established when Berengar entered the camp a few minutes later. Most of these men were among their respective units' elites and had formed a rudimentary protection unit for some time now. When Berengar saw this, he realized that he was now a king and needed a dedicated unit to protect himself and his family. He decided that after this war was over, he would establish a proper royal guard. After gazing fondly upon his soldiers, Berengar mounted his steed where the unit tasked with his protection followed suit. After seeing that the team was prepared to enter the city, Berengar called out his commands. "Forward march." With this said, the King of Austria and his guard marched into the burning city as conquerors. As they passed through the gatehouse that was now nothing more than splinters and debris, Berengar noticed the pile of corpses, which mainly consisted of the Italian defenders. The rear echelon of his forces was already piling the bodies up into wagons so they could be properly disposed of. The scent of smoke and blood filled the air as Berengar advanced further into the city. What he saw was his troops looting everything of value and restraining the citizens so that they could not resist. It became increasingly clear that the level of resistance Berengar's army faced after entering the city was practically non-existent. Aside from a few hundred Italian defenders held up within the city's castle, the rest of Milan had already surrendered peacefully. The city's citizens gazed upon Berengar with a mix of awe and hatred, as they saw the legendary figure in the flesh. Striding forth on horseback as if conquering their city was as natural as breathing air. In just a few hours, the once mighty city of Milan had fallen, and its riches plundered by the Austrian invaders. Despite this, no citizens chose to resist. They were well aware of the futility of fighting against the Royal Austrian army. News of the defeat of Verona had already spread across northern Italy, as well as the disastrous defeat in the Adriatic that sent the remainder of their navy to the depths of the Mediterranean. In the eyes of many Italian citizens, this war was already over, and the empire had lost. Despite this, the emperor did not offer terms of surrender, nor would Berengar accept them, not until he had seized Florence and taken the vast fortune of the Medicis for himself. In doing so, he would cripple his most giant enemy financially, and that was the Catholic Church. With this in mind, the city of Milan fell in a near-effortless victory for the Austrian royal army. What could have taken days of brutal conflict lasted a mere matter of hours. This would not be the last time Berengar ransacked a city in such a manner. After all, the will of the Italian people to fight against such an overwhelming foe who wanted nothing more than independence was waning by the day. Chapter 327 One last act of desperation. Emperor Balsamo Corsini was sitting upon his imperial throne within the city of Florence. News of Milan's fall had just reached his ears, and he could hardly believe it. If it were not coming from a trusted source, the man would never dare to believe such shocking words. The Holy Roman Emperor swallowed the saliva built up in his throat before asking the question on his mind to the general standing before him. "Can you repeat what you just said for me?" Upon being asked this question, the general did not hesitate to respond with the words he had just spoken moments before. He sighed with defeat as he announced the grim news that he had only recently received. Milan has fallen. It took the Austrian army roughly an hour to penetrate the city's defenses. Afterward, resistance to the Austrian invaders ended as swiftly as it had begun. According to reports, the Austrians have been ransacking the wealth of our northernmost cities. Anything of value that can be taken has been stripped from the local populace, leaving the population poor and destitute. With this clarification, the emperor rested his head in his hands as he gazed at the floor with a panicked expression. He could seldom believe Milan had fallen so quickly, especially after he dispatched forces to hamper the Austrian advance. As such, he promptly asked about the status of his skirmishers. "What about the troops we have set in the field? How many of them remain to slow down the Austrian army?" The general who had given the emperor his report cleared his throat before speaking up about the status of their skirmishers. "We have lost contact with the forces who were supposed to halt the Austrian advance. My guess is the Austrians found a way to hunt them down. The last message we received from any of our units in the field is a bit cryptic." The emperor frowned as he heard this. In fact, he was quite afraid to ask, but he knew it was his duty to do so. As such, Balsamo masked his internal trepidation with a facade of confidence as he asked the general for his report. What were the contents of the message? The general once more did not hesitate to present the evidence. As such, he looked at the message written down with what appeared to be the blood of the man who had written it before speaking up. There are only 2 words: Austrian ghosts. Balsamo was a deeply religious and superstitious man. As such, his prior confident facade came crumbling down as soon as he heard the phrase. The emperor immediately stood up from his seat with an expression filled with dread before breaking out into a mad outburst. "What sorcery is this? Berengar can control the souls of the damned. Is that what my soldiers mean to tell me? How can we defeat such evil?" While the emperor was having a mental breakdown, the general cleared his throat and tried to present a reasonable alternative to his liege. As such, he responded with a firm resolve. "I don't believe the soldiers meant literal ghosts. I think what the report means is that Austria has hidden units that move in the shadows and swiftly attack our forces while remaining unseen. These alleged ghosts are a serious threat and need to be treated as such." Upon hearing a reasonable explanation, the emperor collapsed in his seat as he sighed heavily in relief. It took him a moment or two to calm his nerves. After all, the manner that the Austrians had managed to advance through his territory was already borderlining the supernatural. The emperor spent the next 2 moments reflecting on his options. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the possibility of victory in this war was practically non-existent. His navy was utterly decimated and lied at the bottom of the Mediterranean. His trade fleet was being pillaged by a combination of Berengar's privateers and foreign pirates with impunity, and as such, the economy had suffered severely. Without a proper navy, his trade would come grinding to a halt soon enough. As for the Swiss front, it was a lost cause. Half of the nation had already fallen after the defeat at Zurich. The Swiss leaders were now convening to negotiate their surrender to Adelbrand and his army of 25,000 Austrians. Balsamo swore that if he were capable, he would march his armies into the Swiss Confederation and remind them who they were subject to. However, he could not do this. He had suffered serious losses against Berengar's army, and the Austrians had cut off any route into the Swiss Confederation. While all of this was happening, Berengar's main force was plowing straight through Lombardy and would soon enough be at his gates. Though the emperor's forces had captured some weapons from Berengar's army, it would be years before they could adequately reverse engineer such advanced weaponry. Without a doubt, the war would be over long before then. Thus, the Holy Roman Emperor was left with 2 options: surrender and expect leniency, or fight in a last stand against the Austrian army. The emperor was too proud to bow his head to some lowly baron who proclaimed himself king. No, there was only one way for this conflict to end. He would rather die than admit defeat to an upstart like Berengar. Emperor Balsamo Corsini quickly rose from his seat and dusted off his attire before reclaiming his determination. After doing so, he boldly declared to his general his final plan for turning this war around. "General, gather every man and child that can bear arms within our remaining territory. Equip them with whatever weapons you can find, and bring them to Florence. If Berengar wants to defeat me, he will have to take the city from an army of over 100,000 men." The general sighed when he heard this. Bringing such a large army to Florence would deplete their food reserves. Even if the Royal Austrian army were to be defeated at Florence, the capital would starve by the time winter arrived. The war was already lost, and yet the emperor was too proud to admit defeat. Nevertheless, the general had his orders and nodded his head before responding in the affirmative. "I will do what you ask, but your majesty, as your general, I feel I must advise you against such a drastic measure. Regardless of whether we win or lose this battle, this war as a whole will be the end of the Holy Roman Empire. Even if we manage to repel the Austrians, our armies will be devastated, and our economy will be in ruin. If we genuinely undergo such a disastrous option, we will no longer have the ability to project enough strength to control our vassals, and one by one, they will follow in the path of Austria." However, despite this advice, the emperor was undeterred from his course of action. Either Austria would break its back against the walls of Florence, or the empire would crumble. However, the dignity of the emperor would never falter. As such, Balsamo Corsini glared at his general before responding. Your opinion is noted, but you will do what I ask, or I will find a general who will. After hearing that the emperor was set on this suicidal path, the general sighed heavily before nodding his head. The future was bleak for the empire, but he supposed all good things must come to an end. After all, the vassals that made up the Holy Roman Empire were largely autonomous to begin with. With this in mind, the general steeled his resolve before responding to the emperor's demands. Very well, you shall have your army, but when the empire begins to fall apart, let it be known that I advised against this course of action. The emperor said nothing and allowed the general to depart in silence. Instead, he sat down upon his throne once more and took a large swig from his chalice filled with wine. The man continued to drink until the contents within the glass were entirely within the confines of his stomach. The emperor had faith that Berengar would not so quickly seize the capital of the empire with such a large force of defenders. Even if most of them were nothing more than peasant levies, bodies were bodies, and Berengar's power could be overwhelmed eventually. As such, while Berengar rapidly began to advance upon the city of Parma, the empire had started withdrawing all of its forces within the field and the garrisons which guarded the northern towns to Florence. As for southern Italy, they too were tasked with bringing forth troops to defend Florence from the Austrian invasion. The Battle of Florence would become the determining battle in this war for Austrian independence. Whether or not the empire would crumble in defeat was mere speculation at this point. After all, the union of the various imperial states was still beneficial to most of its members. One thing was sure, though, this battle would have long-reaching effects on the power structure of the European continent. Chapter 328 Developing the Needle Rifle. Ludwig stood on the range contained within the weapons testing facility that lies outside the boundaries of Kufstein city. In his hand was a prototype that he had been working on for some time now. Due to the advancements in chemical technology such as mercury fulminate and the creation of percussion caps, Ludwig had finally been able to complete his design. The working title for this weapon was the Schmidt Needle Rifle. The reason for this name was the fact that this single-shot, bolt-action rifle used a long needle to penetrate through the end of a paper cartridge, where it would strike the percussion cap embedded within and thus ignite the powder propelling the bullet downrange. The rifle was equipped with a 33.66-inch barrel that utilized the same polygonal rifling that the 1419 Jaeger rifles were equipped with. It also used the .451 lead alloy projectile. Unlike the hexagonal bullets issued to the Jaeger rifles, this needle rifle utilized a cylindrical projectile of a more traditional design. The sights on this gun were ladder-style iron sight that graduated from 100 to 1,600 yards, though truthfully, that maximum range was being optimistic. Unlike needle rifle designs from Berengar's previous life, this rifle was manufactured with durability and reliability in mind, and as such, it utilized a reinforced locking system and a more robust needle that was easily replaceable from the rear of the action in the event that it became damaged. Overall, its appearance resembled the Mauser Model 1871 from Berengar's previous life. Ludwig had designed a new blade-style bayonet that was similar to the 1871-84 pattern bayonet from Berengar's past life. The most significant difference between the Mauser 1871 and the Schmidt needle rifle was that this was not a centerfire weapon, but a needle gun. Ludwig loaded the hand-rolled paper cartridge into the chamber before shutting the bolt. After he did so, he aimed down the sights at 100 yards before pulling the trigger. The needle on the bolt pierced through the rear of the paper cartridge and struck the percussion cap, igniting the powder and sending the .451 lead alloy projectile downrange and into the target. As for the rest of the paper cartridge, it was blown out the bore of the rifle. The moment Ludwig fired the cartridge, he cycled the action to the rear, where he placed another cartridge in the chamber before firing at the target once more. It was another solid hit. After doing so, he continued this for a total of 12 rounds in a single minute. The garrison who were watching him test out this new rifle were amazed by its fire rate. However, they were uncertain of its effective range, and due to Ludwig being a poor shot, he had not hit all of his targets. With this in mind, a man walked over to Ludwig. He was not wearing the standard army uniform. Instead, he was dressed in the Feldgrau uniform used by the Jaeger Corps. This man was using crutches as he approached Ludwig. Evidently this young soldier was wounded in battle and sent home to recover. He just so happened to be hanging out with one of his friends from the garrison when Ludwig showed up to test fire his new weapon. The Jaeger was blown away by the rate of fire of the weapon. However, he was not impressed with the accuracy. Being the expert marksman that he was, he deduced it was most likely due to a lack of proper training from the man who wielded it, and as such, he decided to volunteer for the position to test the gun after seeing it was safe to operate. "My lord, Corporal Latch Wickton at your service. It would be my honor to test this rifle for you to see how effective its range is. That is if you do not mind an old Jaeger like myself doing so." Ludwig looked over at the man and noticed he was dressed in a military uniform unlike one he had ever seen before. It was sleek and lacking the noticeable embellishment that most of Berengar's troops used. Despite Ludwig's lack of formality with the uniform, the old man recognized the silver oak leaf pin on the man's field cap which designated him as a member of the Royal Austrian Jaeger Corps. It was a crime to reproduce the pin and use it without authorization. As such, the man before him was either a member of Berengar's elite forces or a fraud risking a criminal sentence. Ludwig was betting on the former of those two possibilities and nodded his head with a stoic expression. "Not at all. Show me what you Jaegers are capable of." The soldier smiled and sat down at the bench rest before grabbing a hold of the needle rifle and placing a paper cartridge in its chamber just as Ludwig had done prior. He then adjusted its iron sights from 100 yards to 1,000 yards, a shot he was usually capable of pulling off with his Jaeger rifle under ideal conditions. He gauged the wind in the air before squeezing the trigger, sending the projectile downrange at a steel target that was sitting out at roughly 1,000 yards. The audible ping of the lead crashing against steel resounded throughout the testing field and signaled to everyone present that the Jaeger had hit his mark. This was a phenomenal feat for the average soldiers of the garrison. Most troops in the Austrian army were unaware of just how proficient the Jaegers were at long-range combat. They had never witnessed them in battle due to them being a force deployed far ahead of the traditional battlefield. After pulling the trigger and sending the round downrange, the Jaeger immediately cycled the bolt back to the rear and put another paper cartridge lying on the table into the chamber before sending the bolt home. After doing so, he aimed down at another target 1,200 yards downrange and adjusted his sights to compensate for the difference in distance. Having made his calculations, the young soldier pulled the trigger, and once more, an audible ping resounded throughout the range. This action of 2 shots in under 10 seconds successfully hitting targets at such a distance shocked the crowd of soldiers even more. After the Jaeger had followed up with a third shot at 1,500 yards that also successfully hit its target, he cycled the bolt back to clear the weapon, not that it needed to do so, before chuckling to himself. As he did so, he cried out at the top of his lungs. "Wonderful, simply wonderful. I need one of these for when I go back to the field. How much do you want for it?" However, Ludwig shook his head as he informed the young soldier about the reality of the weapon. "This is just a prototype. The final product will have to be approved by the king for service in the army. You will have to wait until then." Despite Ludwig declining his offer, the Jaeger was persistent and made a sizable offer. "If you can make another one of these for me, I will pay 2, no 3 guldens. I know plenty of my comrades who would do the same." Ludwig was tempted to take the soldier up on his offer, but the weapon still hadn't been thoroughly tested yet, and he didn't want the man to lose his life due to a malfunction. As such, he declined once more. "Once I figure out the kinks in the rifle and improve it, I will be happy to sell you one if you really can't wait until they become standard issue." The soldier frowned in response to this, but he understood that Ludwig had good intentions. As such, he agreed to the man's terms. "All right. Don't keep me waiting too long. In a few weeks, I will be back in the field, and I would feel a hell of a lot safer with this rifle as my primary weapon than the current issue Jaeger rifle." Ludwig scratched the back of his head as he responded to the soldier's eagerness to purchase his rifle. "I will see what I can do. Hopefully, I can have a functional variant made for you to use in the field by then." After saying this, the Jaeger thanked Ludwig before picking up his crutches and heading off from the testing facility. He had a broad smile spread across his face like a kid on Christmas. Such an excellent weapon solved his biggest complaints about the currently issued muzzle-loading rifles. As for Ludwig, he sighed in relief after the overly excited soldier was gone before picking up his prototype rifle and bringing it back to the shop. So far everything seemed like it functioned properly, but he was going to need to stress test the weapon over the coming days to make sure there were no serious issues with it. However, for the prototype, the weapon was beyond functional, and that made him happy. He could not wait until King Berengar could finally witness the rifle that the old man had designed entirely by himself. He could already anticipate the commendation he would get for creating such a revolutionary type of weapon. With that said, Ludwig returned to the state-run armory that he managed, where he began to manufacture more paper cartridges to test the rifle in the upcoming days. By the time Berengar marched on Florence, there would be thousands of these Schmidt needle rifles in the hands of Berengar's most elite forces. Chapter 329 The Swiss Confederation surrenders. In the city of Geneva, on the other side of the Swiss Confederation from where the Royal Austrian Army currently occupied, various high-ranking noblemen were gathered to discuss the reality of the war they were facing. These men in their entirety spoke the German language and were considerably closer to the Austrians ethnically than they were to their Italian masters. As vassals of the Holy Roman Empire, they held a high degree of autonomy. With this in mind, they decided to exercise their right to negotiate their surrender to the Kingdom of Austria. Adelbrand von Salzburg, general of the Austrian army, tasked with invading the Swiss Confederation, had sent his demands to the remaining leaders of the Swiss Confederation. The terms that Adelbrand had made were simple. The Austrian army would only yield their conquest if the Swiss Confederation in its entirety agreed to annexation by the Austrian crown, where it would be reformed as the Grand Duchy of Switzerland. The Grand Duchy of Switzerland would effectively become a vassal state of the Kingdom of Austria and would be subject to all laws as established in the Austrian constitution. To the lords of the Swiss Confederation, this was not an appealing prospect. They would be giving up the degree of autonomy they had maintained under the Holy Roman Emperor in favor of a strong centralized government under the authority of a single monarch. Not only that, but they would be forced to usher in the military, political, economic, agricultural, and industrial reforms that Berengar had established in Austria. Thus, these men would be losing a significant degree of political and military power. This thought specifically caused one of the more prominent noblemen they had gathered for this meeting to be quite irritated as he presented his case against surrendering to the Austrian crown. The upstart Berengar von Kufstein has gone too far with his demands. He expects us to kneel before him and beg him for mercy. Never. We should fight until our last breaths against this annexation. It is a humiliation to the Swiss people. This count was not the only one who felt this way, as several members of the nobility immediately expressed support for this viewpoint. Here, fuck Austria and their young king. Death before dishonor. However, a few of the noblemen present were not entirely against the idea of annexation. These men were reformists, or at the very least, the population they ruled over was primarily comprised of reformists. As such, they had a responsibility to hold up the other side of the argument. One of these men was a count, the Count of Freiburg, and he was close personal friends with Count Rainer von Kuhr, who had surrendered to the Austrian crown during the initial invasion. He understood better than anyone the reasons for doing so. As such, he presented an alternative to the more boisterous members of the Swiss high nobility. It is in my opinion that these demands are not unreasonable. While Austria will hold more control over our lands than the Empire, it has become increasingly apparent that we are witnessing the rise of a new power with the Kingdom of Austria, one that might unify the German world into a single cohesive empire. Before long, Florence will fall, and with it, the dignity of the imperial crown. Under Austrian reign, we will become as wealthy and prosperous as they have become. The age of feudalism and knights is coming to an end. If we do not embrace this new era, we will be left behind in the darkness plaguing our lands. If we refuse the Austrians' terms, they will conquer us, and when they do, they will replace every one of us with an Austrian nobleman of their choosing. We share many ethnic and cultural aspects with the Austrians, far more than the Italians. It is in the best interest of the Swiss people and its nobility to kneel before the Austrian crown. When the men gathered heard this, they fell silent. What the Count said made sense. They did not have the military capacity to continue a war with the Austrians for much longer. If they chose to do so, they would only invoke the ire of the Austrian crown, which would surely result in them losing all of their power and authority over their lands, if not their lives altogether. Despite this reality, many men were reluctant to hand over their long-held power to the Kingdom of Austria and its centralized government. As such, they began proposing new ideas to maintain their autonomy. Could we not negotiate with the Austrians about receiving the same degree of autonomy that we have under the Empire? After all, their demands of total surrender are a bit insulting. Surely the Austrian king can understand our grievances? However, Those in favor of surrendering knew this was not likely and immediately dismissed this idea. With what power can we make such demands of King Berengar? The Austrians respect nothing other than the power of one's military might. They have made it clear that they want to incorporate us into their kingdom, under their laws. I can understand why, to them, we are backward and primitive people. With their advanced agricultural systems, they can feed their people a minimum of 3 meals a day, while ours are severely malnourished. Such a thing has a significant impact on prosperity, productivity, and population growth. As noblemen, if we surrender, we might be losing a substantial degree of power, but we would be making up for it in the fortune our houses will gain. This is the reality we are facing. A new era is upon us, and we can either submit to the winds of change or be blown away by them. If any of you wish to decline the terms presented to us, then so be it. However, I know that I will personally surrender to the Austrians, guaranteeing my family's future in the process. This is an unwinnable war, and you all know it. The words spoken by this man had a significant effect on the other noblemen present. They quickly began to realize that even if a few of them resisted until the end, others among their ranks would surrender on their terms. This caused all confidence in a united resistance against the Austrian incursion to collapse instantly. Those members of the Swiss nobility who moments prior were yelling to resist Austria at all costs now had downcast expressions as they gazed at their compatriots who were ready to kneel before the Austrian crown as their new master. The Swiss Confederation had become a hotbed of the German Reformation. They knew that the people they presided over were already sick and tired of fighting a war with the homeland of their faith on behalf of the Catholic Emperor. With this in mind, a vote was now held between the various Swiss noblemen who had gathered in this meeting. An older nobleman who had remained silent until now was the first to speak up. All in favor of surrendering to the Austrian crown under the terms they have presented? Over 3/4 of the nobility within the room voted in favor of this agreement. The older man immediately noticed that a few men remained utterly silent in response to this vote. As such, he once more spoke up by proposing the second option. All in favor of resisting the Austrian crown until our last dying breath? Despite the unwillingness of 1/4 of the noblemen to surrender, there was complete and utter silence regarding this vote. Those who once wished to resist were now abstaining. With this in mind, the older man sighed before making the decision known. 3/4 are in favor of surrendering, and 1/4 are abstaining. The decision is final. We will surrender to the Austrian crown under the terms they have presented, and allow the full annexation of the Swiss Confederation. From henceforth, we shall be known as the Grand Duchy of Switzerland, with the Grand Duke to be chosen by our liege, the King of Austria, His Majesty Berengar von Kufstein. The moment these words were spoken, only silence filled the air. Even those ready to surrender were not entirely eager to see the changes that would come to Switzerland in the coming years. After all, to give up the degree of autonomy they had, to become a state of the Kingdom of Austria was not something to be taken lightly. However, despite their reluctance, one thing was certain: the Swiss theater of the Austrian War for Independence was over, and aside from a small occupying force left behind with the intent to establish control over the newly formed Grand Duchy of Switzerland, the remaining troops would be pouring into the Italian theater to support the main army in their attempt to lay siege Florence. With the Emperor's last stand on the horizon, Berengar would need every soldier he could muster in his attempt to siege a city filled with belligerents. It was bound to be a brutal and bloody conflict, and the 20,000 soldiers who would be arriving from the land formerly known as the Swiss Confederation was sure to aid in Austria's chances of victory. Chapter 330 Returning to Service. Corporal Lach Wichten sat in the back of a supply wagon that was headed to the front lines. The new and improved Schmidt needle rifle was in his hands that Ludwig had improved after thorough and rigorous stress testing. The young man cleaned the rifle with great care while dressed in his camouflage smock and field cap, with his helmet lying beside him. This supply convoy not only brought forth much-needed supplies to the front lines but reinforcements to replace the soldiers who were wounded or killed in battle. Some of these men, like Lach, were returning to the front lines after being injured themselves. The young corporal could not wait to show off his new prototype rifle to the soldiers in his unit. As such, he was eager to regroup with them. By now, Berengar and his army had advanced beyond the city of Milan after stealing its treasures and was on its route to the small city of Parma, which lay between them and Bologna. Any minute now, he would approach Berengar's army, where he would likely regroup with at least one of the Jaeger units that were nearby. While the Italians had pulled back the majority of their soldiers to reinforce the city of Florence in a desperate last stand against the might of the Royal Austrian Army, they had kept some small amount of troops in the field in an attempt to slow down the Austrian advance to buy the main Italian army some much-needed time. When Lach finally saw the tents of the Austrian encampment appear in the distance, he slung his rifle over his shoulder and placed his helmet upon his head before rushing towards the camp. The young corporal waved at the supply convoy as he departed. When Lach arrived, he was surprised to see that his company was currently resting in the encampment and not out in the field. He quickly approached Captain Andreas Jaeger as he saluted the man with respect. "Corporal Lach Wickton reporting for duty, sir." Captain Jaeger returned Lach's salute before responding. "At ease, Corporal. I hope you are well rested because we will be deploying to the front lines shortly." After saying this, the captain noticed the rifle slung on Lach's shoulder was vastly different from the muzzle-loading Jaeger rifles that were currently issued to the Jaeger Corps and could not help but inquire about it. "Corporal, what is that, and where did you get it?" The moment Lach heard this, he unslung the weapon and presented it to his commanding officer. "This is called a needle rifle. While I was away, Ludwig invented it. This particular rifle is a second prototype, but Ludwig has assured me it is free from any potentially harmful malfunctions. It has the same degree of accuracy as our currently issued rifles but is capable of firing 12 rounds a minute." When Andreas heard this, he was shocked that such a weapon existed, and as such, he wanted to see a demonstration. However, firing a gun while in camp was explicitly forbidden, and thus he would have to wait to see how well the rifle functioned until it could be demonstrated in the field. As such, the man sighed before giving the corporal his orders. "Get back to your squad. I am sure they will be happy to see you have made a full recovery." Lach saluted Captain Andreas once more before replying in the affirmative. "Yes, sir." After Andreas saluted the young man back, Lach returned to his tent, where he met with his fellow soldiers. As for Andreas, he immediately began to search for his commanding officer to inform him of this new weapon. Eventually, he found Colonel Dietrich von Lehns in a meeting with King Berengar von Kufstein within the command tent. Knowing his place, the man patiently waited by the tent side until his superior officer departed. However, when Dietrich finally exited the tent, he was alongside Berengar, who looked at the young captain with confusion. Seeing the king in front of him, Captain Andreas immediately saluted to him. "Your Majesty, Captain Andreas Jaeger, reporting to his superior officer about some information received from a soldier returning to service after medical leave." Berengar was curious as to what valuable intel a returning soldier could have and, as such, spoke up before Colonel Dietrich could respond. "Speak, if this is something so valuable that you would await by the tent side for your Colorado, then you are free to discuss it with me." Captain Andreas looked over to his commanding officer to see if he had permission. Meanwhile, the aging colonel gazed at Andreas as if he were an idiot and silently nodded his head. As such, Captain Andreas no longer hesitated to speak his mind. "One of my soldiers, Corporal Lach Wickton, has returned with a prototype weapon he has purchased from Baronet Ludwig. He calls it a needle rifle and says it is capable of firing a projectile out to a similar distance that our Jaeger rifles are capable of with more than twice the rate of fire." When Berengar heard this, he was shocked. The only needle rifles he knew of were the Dries and Chassepot from his previous life, and they lacked in terms of long-range firepower compared to the Whitworth rifle that he had based his Jaeger rifles upon. Not only that, but as far as he was aware, they did not yet have mercury fulminate to manufacture percussion caps. As such, he was pretty skeptical of this claim. Thus he responded with a hint of curiosity in his tone. "Did the soldier call it a needle rifle?" When Berengar asked this, the captain looked at him with confusion in his eyes before nodding his head. Was it possible that Berengar knew about Ludwig's designs? Then again, he was the king, so it made sense if he knew about experimental weapons that were shrouded in secrecy. The moment Berniger witnessed the man's nod, his expression turned serious as he spoke with an authoritative tone befitting a monarch. "Take me to this man right away." Andreas led both Berengar and Colonel Dietrich to the tent where Lach and his squad were resting. The moment Captain Andreas arrived, the men jumped to attention, saluting their commanding officer. However, they were shocked to see the colonel of the Jaeger Corps and the monarch himself standing behind their captain. Before any of the soldiers could get a word out, Berengar immediately said his decree. "Which one of you is Corporal Lach Wickton?" Lach was astonished to find that the King of Austria himself had come searching for him. As such, he proudly presented himself to Berengar with his chest puffed out. "Corporal Lach Wigton at your service, your majesty." After hearing this, Berengar inspected the man closely. Noticing that there was nothing out of the ordinary, he quickly cut to the chase. "Show me the rifle you have brought with you." Lach did not hesitate to do so as he retrieved the needle rifle and checked to see if it was clear before handing it over to Berengar with the bolt open. The Royal Austrian Army had always stressed firearms safety as a priority in the training of the recruits. As such, a soldier would be punished severely if they did not first check to see if a weapon was clear before handing it over to someone else. Berengar closely inspected the rifle and noticed that it greatly resembled a Mauser Model 1871 from his past life, except instead of a single-shot centerfire rifle, it was a needle-fired rifle. The gun's needle was easily replaceable if it was damaged, much like on the final design of the Dreiss rifle that was added to the weapon variant in 1874. Berengar gazed down the bore and inspected it to see whether it had traditional or polygonal rifling. To his surprise, Ludwig had gone the extra mile with these rifles and improved the rifling just like how the current issued Jaeger rifles utilized. After closely observing the rifle, Berengar placed one of his hands out and ordered the soldier, "Give me one of the cartridges." When the man heard this, he rushed over to his cot, where he retrieved a paper cartridge from his webgear which contained the cylindrical .451 Whitworth-style projectile. When Berengar saw this, a wry smile appeared on his face as he expressed his thoughts aloud. "Ludwig, you are a genius." Without any guidance, Ludwig had done the unthinkable. He had manufactured a needle rifle from scratch, centuries ahead of its natural time. Having never shot a needle rifle before, Berengar was eager to test out the weapon, and as such, he swiftly walked out of the tent, where the others nearby pursued him. After leaving the confines of the camp, Berengar gave a command to his soldiers. "Set up a target 1,000 yards out, I want to test this rifle." The soldiers received their orders and placed a wooden bucket out at 1,000 yards before returning to Berengar's side. Berengar immediately dialed in the sights so that they were at the appropriate distance, where he proceeded to shoulder the rifle in his left arm and gaze with his one good eye down the iron sights. After acquiring his target, he inhaled deeply while holding his breath before squeezing the trigger. The moment he did so, the needle impacted the percussion cap and ignited the powder contained within, sending the projectile downrange at over 1,300 feet per second where it struck its target, knocking the bucket into the air. The moment he did so, Berengar exhaled deeply and cocked the action back before handing the rifle back to Corporal Lach with a broad smile on his face. He was pleased with the performance of the rifle and could not contain his joy. As such, he grabbed a hold of Colonel Dietrich before giving him an order. "Send word to Ludwig. I want him to produce as many of these rifles as he is able. Before we march on Florence, I want your entire Jaeger Corps outfitted with these weapons." With this said, Dietrich immediately saluted Berengar and responded in the affirmative. "At once, your majesty." With this, Berengar gazed into the distance at the bucket he had just shot with a warm smile curved upon his lips. It would not be long before Ludwig could create rifled breechloaders and cap and ball revolvers with a bit of assistance. Once more, a new era of warfare had just begun thanks to Berengar's intervention in the timeline. Chapter 331 Catfight IV Part 1. With the remainder of the Imperial fleet demolished at the Battle of the Adriatic, privateers and pirates had free rein of attacking Imperial shipping. Honoria and her crew of salty wenches had made quite the fortune in attacking Imperial vessels and pirate ships. Currently, several large wooden chests were lying about within the master bedroom of the castle in Kufstein. These wooden chests displayed the vast wealth that Honoria had personally accumulated during her travels. These chests were filled with Austrian thalers and guldens, and a large amount of them had spilled onto the bed where two beautiful young women lie naked, cuddling up to one another surrounded by wealth. These women were Lind and Honoria. The two girls had long since gotten used to the feel of each other's bodies due to the many nights they had spent engaging in nightly debauchery with Berengar. The King of Austria had more than once joked about how he would kill them if they cheated on him with another man, but entertaining each other was acceptable. After months without the touch of their man, the two had finally given in to their base instincts and entertained the idea that had been embedded in their brains by Berengar's sick sense of humor. The two women had just finished their fun and were now relaxing on the bed together. Eventually, Honoria got up and began to dress. She could not stay in Kufstein forever. There was plenty of other loot to be had, and she was too embarrassed to look at Lind in the eye at the moment. However, Lind had no problem staring at the princess's voluptuous body. As he did so, Lind immediately noticed that Honoria was having difficulty dressing in her undergarments, especially the bra. Eventually, Honoria ripped the straps on her brassiere as she tried to force it on. She was immediately cursing as she did so. Goddammit. When Lind saw this, she placed her hand over her mouth and giggled as she teased the young princess. Honoria, have you grown recently? I thought I noticed a difference in size earlier, but looking at you now, I think my suspicions have been confirmed. Honoria glanced over at Lind, who still lay naked on the bed, where her cheeks immediately began to flush with embarrassment as Lind stared her in the eyes with an amorous gaze. Rather than admit she needed to purchase new undergarments, she instead lashed out at her rival. Oh, like you're one to talk, Lind. What size are those cow udders of yours now? There's no way those things are still D's. Lind crossed her arms under her breasts and showed them off to Honoria as if they were her crown jewels. With a sultry smile on her face, she responded to the young princess. I'll have you know there now. Why are you so flushed? Do you desire to have a taste of mommy's milk? Honoria's face went from embarrassed to disgusted as she heard Lind say this, partially because she knew that just a few minutes prior, she had been sucking the milk from Linda's chest as if she were her babe. Apparently, Berengar was not the only one who enjoyed the taste of Linda's milk. Reflecting upon this, Honoria looked away and deflected the question. I need new underwear. Do you want to go shopping with me? Lind immediately got up from her seat and approached Honoria with a wicked smile on her face. The young spymaster had just thought of a brilliant idea. As such, she nodded her head while grabbing a hold of Honoria and dragging her into her embrace before whispering in her ear. I think the little wife has also grown a bit. Wouldn't it be fun to show the main wife just what she's competing with? It was no secret that Adela and Linda's relationship was tumultuous, to say the least. Lind much preferred the company of Honoria, and as such, she desired to create an alliance with her against their biggest competition, which was little Adela. Honoria instantly understood Linda's intention. She responded with an equally malicious grin carved upon her immaculate lips. I think that's a splendid idea. As such, the two women began to kiss like Berengar had encouraged them to do many times while he shared his bed with the two girls. After breaking apart, Lind started to get dressed alongside Honoria. After they were fully clothed in the luxurious dresses that Berengar had purchased for them, the two ladies gathered a pouch filled with coins that were spread about and walked down the staircase in an attempt to find Adela. As per usual, the little queen-to-be was playing the harp like a flawless little angel. The very sight of her innocent appearance caused both Lind and Honoria to seethe internally. However, they masked their displeasure with friendly facades as they both approached Adela. The moment the girl saw her two rivals approach with friendly smiles on their faces, she knew they were up to no good. As such, she ceased playing the harp and immediately scowled at the two wenches while she inquired about their reason for bothering her. What do you two want? Adela had recently turned 16, and she was counting down the days for Berengar to return from his war so that they could get married. Even though she tolerated Berengar's sexual activities with the two vixens before her, she was not exactly on the best terms with either Lind or Honoria. She had some history with Lind, and as such, she was friendlier to her than she was to the Byzantine princess who showed up in Berengar's life and stole his heart out of nowhere. The unholy alliance between Spymaster and Pirate Queen was something Adela had come to dread. Though she did not know what Lind and Honoria got up to while Berengar was away, she knew at the very least they were close enough to service the young king together. Something Adela greatly disapproved of. Seeing the young fiancé glaring at the two of them brought a sadistic grin to Lind and Honoria's pretty faces as they made their request to Adela. Lind was the first to speak as she had a better relationship with the girl. It is nothing much, Adela. We seem to have outgrown our undergarments and intend to go shopping. We were wondering if you wanted to join us? After all, as Berengar's women, it is our duty to bond together. These words caused Adela to grit her teeth. She had recently bumped up to a C cup and felt that she could now compete with Honoria and Lind, but apparently, the two women were also growing still. She immediately lashed out to Lind about her massive breasts to cover her own insecurities. What are you, some kind of milk cow? How the hell are you still growing? Honoria began to giggle. She had asked a similar question just a few minutes prior. On the other hand, Lind feigned offense to Adela's comments, as if she were a perfect actress. Lind began to break out in tears as she manipulated Adela into coming along with them. "There's no reason to say such mean words, little Adela. I just wanted to spend some quality time with you, and here you are making fun of my appearance. Do you have any idea how that feels?" Adela sighed heavily as she heard this. She knew for a fact that Lind was pretending to hurt. After all, the woman had a hide as tough as steel, and yet, she still found herself swayed by Linda's charade. "Fine. Against my better judgment, I will go with you too. However, you better not play any tricks on me." In response, Lind quickly grabbed a hold of the girl and stuffed her into her bust as she petted her head. "You mean it, yay." After doing so, she released Adela and grabbed a hold of her hand before leading her out of the castle and into the city below. The trio of beautiful young women was headed to a local clothing store that catered specifically to the upper-class women of Austria. It was a shop owned and operated entirely by women. There they could get a proper measurement of their bodies without fearing Berengar doing something drastic like outright executing the tailor for touching them. As Lind and Honoria escorted the little queen into town, Adela could not help but regret her decision. She knew that somehow, these two bitches were going to mess with her. She just did not know what exactly they had up their sleeves. Meanwhile, Lind and Honoria were grinning at one another. They could not wait to see the look on Adela's face when the two of them came out from the dressing room clothed in nothing but wedding lingerie. They hoped it would show the little queen just what she was going up against in their future polygamous marriage with Berengar. Whether their plan would work or backfire spectacularly had yet to be seen. Thus, while Berengar was waging war against his enemies for the sake of independence, his future wives were having a war of their own. Chapter 332 Catfight IV Part 2. Lind and Honoria held onto Adela's hand as they dragged her through the entrance of the store embedded within the wealthiest area of Kufstein's trade district. The closer one got to the upper-class neighborhoods near the trade district, the more luxurious the shops became and the higher their prices. At the top of the trade district, just a stone's throw away from the city's wealthiest neighborhood, was a relatively large clothing shop. This shop catered exclusively to the upper-class women of Austria, more commonly than not noblewomen. It was run by the younger sister of the previous Duke of Austria, and as such, the store was named the Habsburgs Boutique. As one of the last surviving members of the main Habsburg line, Duke Wilmar's younger sister Lise had moved to Kufstein after the fall of Vienna during the Bavarian occupation. She was a middle-aged woman who was quite beautiful despite her age. Lise was a widow without any children and had only managed to survive the von Wittelsbach's attack because she lived at her family's original residence in Habsburg, Switzerland, at the time of Duke Wilmar's invasion of Austria. When she heard of her family's demise, she nearly died of grief. However, news reached her of Conrad's survival, and thus she made her way to Kufstein to look after her young nephew. Unfortunately, by the time she arrived, Berengar had killed the little brat by pushing him out a window. However, Lise had no clue about the true origins of Conrad's death. Instead, she believed the stories that the boy had killed himself. Choosing to believe that the new Duke and current King of Austria was not the kind of man his enemies painted him as. While in Kufstein, Lise fell in love with the fashion designs that Berengar had come up with and used what little wealth remained of her family's assets to buy a shop. She exclusively dealt with products created by Berengar's garment factories. Since opening her shop, she had amassed quite a small fortune and saw many young beautiful women buy her products. However, none were as beautiful as the three women who entered her store on this day. While Lind and Honoria had visited this shop in the past, Adela, who lived in Graz until recently, had never entered the store. As such, Lise, who was sipping out of a cup of coffee and gazing at the returning guests, was quite shocked to see a living angel such as Adela enter her shop. Among the other two women next to her, Lise knew that the young blonde girl with twin tails would one day be the most beautiful of them all. Being well acquainted with both Lind and Honoria, the mature beauty graciously approached Berengar's lovers with the intent to inquire about who this little angel was. "Lind, Honoria, it has been some time. I am glad to see you have returned to my humble shop. Tell me, who is this gorgeous young woman alongside you?" The moment Lind and Honoria heard the old women refer to Adela in such a manner, they felt their stomachs churn. This was not exactly what they had in mind when they brought the girl here. Nevertheless, Lind put on a friendly facade as she introduced Adela to the shopkeeper. "This is Lady Adela von Gratz. She is King Berengar's fiancée. They will soon be getting married. As such, We have come to help her pick out some bridal lingerie. The moment Lind said this, Adela gazed at her with a shocked expression. She was not informed of such a thing. She thought they were simply there to buy regular underwear. As such, her ivory cheeks began to flush red with embarrassment. Lys was a wise, cunning old fox, and she could immediately tell that Adela was surrounded by two wolves who wanted to eat her up. Lind and Honoria may think they were good actors, but compared to Lys, who had grown up in the Habsburg royal court, they were simply greenhorns when it came to such affairs. Seeing that the future queen of her country was in a rivalry with two formidable beauties, Lys decided to give the little angel a helping hand. As such, she grabbed a hold of Adela and dragged her away from the other two girls while putting on a comforting smile. Come, child, let us find something that will bring out your inner beauty. By the time I am done with you, your husband will be happy to call you his bride. Adela could not resist and was instantly whisked away to a changing booth. The moment she and Lys were gone from sight, Lind scowled, and Honoria bit her lip. The Byzantine princess was the first to protest the result of the plan. I didn't think the old hag would screw us over like this. Lind, on the other hand, simply snorted in response. HMPH, it doesn't matter how much help she gets from Lys. That little girl still can't compete with us in terms of physique. While Lind and Honoria were waiting their turn, Adela was stripped naked and covered up in embarrassment. As for Lys, she closely observed the girl's flawless skin and perky pink nipples. Though she was perfectly straight, even she felt the desire to gobble the young bride up. However, she was a professional, so she quickly pulled out a measuring tape before getting down Adela's details. 32C 21-32, you, my dear, are an absolute angel. Your fiancé is one lucky man. You are perfect in every way. Adela immediately began to pout in response to the results. She was the smallest member of her family and the smallest among Berengar's wives. She did not care what the older woman had to say. Nothing could make her feel worse about her physique. The mature beauty noticed Adela's crumbling self-image and immediately decided to repair it. As such, the woman took matters into her own hands and spanked Adela on her soft bottom, snapping the girl out of her daze. Adela gazed at Lys's eyes with fury embedded in her own. However, what the woman said next shook her to her core. You think just because those bitches out there are bigger than you, that you are somehow lesser than them? Trust me, sweetheart, bigger is not always better. When your man sees you on his wedding night, I promise you the only thing he will be thinking about is you. Those two whores are his mistresses, and nothing more. You are the queen, and you need to show them their place. Adela was shocked to hear the woman speak to her in such a way, so much so that she gritted her teeth before expressing her thoughts. They're not just his mistresses. Berengar is going to enact polygamy. He will take them as his second and third wives. Lys was quite shocked to hear this. However, she knew that Berengar was not an ordinary man, and as such, she chuckled lightly before responding to Adela's concerns. Has he told you that you will be his first wife? His queen? Adela gazed up at the woman and nodded her head slowly. In response to this, Lys grabbed onto her shoulder and gave her a thumbs up. That's good. It means you're his number one, and those bitches know it. That's why they dragged you here, to make you feel bad about yourself. How about we show them who's really in charge? Adela tilted her head in confusion before asking for clarification. What did you have in mind? The mature beauty whispered her plan in Adela's ear, causing the little queen to be to flush in embarrassment. However, despite this reaction, she still nodded her head with firm resolve. Okay, let's do it. With this said, Lys left the changing room and handed a slip of paper off to one of her subordinates. After doing so, she approached Lind and Honoria before asking the two girls. Who is next? Lind stepped forward before Honoria could jump at the opportunity and was dragged to the next changing room. Honoria began to pout. However, she instantly became furious when Lind looked behind and stuck out her tongue at the young princess. Lind was quickly stuffed into the dressing room and disrobed. Lys was shocked to see how much Lind had grown since her last visit and could not contain her thoughts. Good God, woman, what the hell are you eating to grow so much at your age? Lind had a smug expression on her face as she asked the mature shopkeeper the thought on her mind. What are my measurements? Though Lind had guessed that she probably had E-cup-sized breasts by now, she wanted to know precisely how splendid her figure was. Lys did not hold back the information and quickly replied to Linda's requests. Even if she lied to the young vixen, it was only a matter of time before she found out. The director of Austrian intelligence's web of information was no joke. 34E2234. A smug grin appeared on Linda's face as she quickly commanded the mature beauty to get her something to wear. Fetch me some bridal lingerie. It won't be long before I have my own wedding, you know. Though Lys wanted to say something to Lind, she chose not to and instead walked out of the changing room before handing another subordinate a slip of paper. After doing so, she grabbed a hold of Honoria and dragged her into yet another changing room before going through the same routine. 33D22-33, you're the same as Lind was a year ago. You three girls, I swear to God, your man is either blessed by the Lord to snag up you three beauties, or the devil curses him. Only time will tell. Honoria was far more pleasant than Lind and made a polite request of the old shopkeeper. Can you please fetch me some bridal lingerie? After hearing this, Lys sighed and nodded her head. Afterward, she left the changing room and handed a slip of paper off to yet another subordinate. Before long, her three aides arrived with 3 sets of bridal lingerie from the store. 2 of them were the same design, but one was slightly different in nature. The 3 sets consisted of a lacy bra, lacy panties, lacy garter belt, and lacy stockings. However, the one reserved for Adela was far more attractive than the other 2. If angels were to wear lingerie, they would wear what the woman had prepared for the future queen. As such, the woman handed the 3 sets to the 3 girls through their changing rooms, and eventually, they all walked out simultaneously. Lind and Honoria were feeling pretty confident with themselves, and as such, they strutted out with style. Meanwhile, Adela was covering herself up as she walked out with red cheeks. Seeing the other 2 girls dressed in their beautiful attire made Adela want to die on the spot. She lost confidence after seeing Linda's massive bust heaving out of her pure white lacy push-up bra, with her perfectly toned plump ass displayed through her enticing G-string, which was covered by a lacy garter belt. Honoria was dressed in a similar set of attire. Though her measurements were slightly smaller, her porcelain skin and white hair blended perfectly with the outfit, creating an exceptionally breathtaking scene. Almost ready to admit defeat at the 2 succubi standing before her, Adela had a downcast expression with a small tear forming in her eye. However, at the next moment, she looked over and saw Lys with an encouraging gaze. The moment she saw this, she remembered what the woman said. She was the queen and the primary wife, and as such, she had to hold her head high. Thus, her meek posture swiftly turned into one of majestic authority, and when she showed off her assets, the other 2 girls were shocked to see just how beautiful Adela was. The primary difference between the lingerie worn by Adela and that worn by the other 2 girls was that Adela's was translucent, showing off her perfect ivory skin, her flawless pastel pink nipples, and pristine pastel pink slit. The moment Lind saw this, she knew she was defeated. While she and Honoria shared a similar skin tone to Adela, the girl simply looked like a living angel when combined with her golden blonde hair and sapphire eyes. As such, Lind and Honoria struggled to contain their rising anger. They had never expected their plan to crush Adela's self-image to backfire so spectacularly. With a little beauty like her as the main wife, Berengar would surely lose interest in them, at least to some extent. The 2 women would no longer have a monopoly over the man they loved, and they knew Adela was too much of a prude to share the wealth, so to speak. Given a few years when Adela fully matured, she was likely to be the most beautiful out of all of them, and that stung. Seeing the expressions on Lind and Honoria's faces, as if they had just witnessed their pet being murdered in front of them, filled Adela with pride. She had finally beaten these 2 harlots at their own game. With this in mind, the girls quickly got changed back into their old attire and did not speak a word to one another as they scrambled to buy enough new underwear to last the test of time. Their shopping spree quickly became a battle to acquire the sexiest wardrobe to appease their man and his tastes. While the war for Austrian independence was soon coming to its climax, the war for Berengar's heart was far from over. Chapter 333. Are you interested now? Lind was sitting within her favorite tea shop, which had begun to sell the remarkable substance of coffee. Sitting across from her was a man from the east that she knew pretty well. A downcast expression was on the man's face as he shifted his eyes to his surroundings, making sure that he had not been followed. After realizing that the place Lind had chosen to discuss critical matters was secure, he let out a heavy sigh of relief. Following this, Andronikos took a sip from his coffee mug before revealing the thoughts that had plagued his mind over the past few weeks. Aretha's is dead. Lind, who was about to take a sip from her coffee, immediately paused as she heard this. She was well aware of the tragic fate of the once mighty strategos of Ionia. After all, her intelligence network had sprawled across the Mediterranean and into the heart of Constantinople. She wore a compassionate expression on her stunning face as she began to speak to the man across from her. I am sorry for your loss, but these things happen in warfare. It is because of this that I pray for the safety of my husband every day. Andronikos was aware that Lind and Berengar were not married, and as such, he rolled his eyes at Linda's words before leaning in close and explaining his suspicions. He didn't die on the battlefield like your agents have reported. He was murdered in cold blood by his troops. Lind had already taken a sip of her drink when Andronikos said this. The moment she heard such a shocking revelation, she began to choke on the creamy brown liquid. It took a few moments for the stunning beauty to recover her composure. As she did so, she whispered to the man across from her in a hushed tone. Do you have proof of this? Andronikos sighed and shook his head before revealing his cards. No, only the word from a loyal soldier who claims to have witnessed the event. However, before I could get my hands on him and find out the truth of the matter, he disappeared. Whoever killed Arethes is someone with great power in the Empire and does not want the truth of his death to be revealed. Lind sighed heavily as she heard this. If what Andronikos said was true, there would be some difficulties with their relations to the East in the upcoming future. As such, she took a bite out of the pfeffernuss cookie that was sitting on her napkin before washing it down with coffee. After doing so, she began to inquire about Andronikos' reason for visiting. Let me guess, you want my agents to investigate the death of Arethes? Andronikos nodded his head in silence. As usual, this beautiful young woman was 2 steps ahead of him. When Lind saw his response, she put on a stoic expression as she began to negotiate with the man. What does the Austrian crown have to gain from such an action? If what you say is true, then somebody powerful, somebody with close ties to the imperial family, is responsible for Arethes' death. As outsiders, if our investigation is discovered, we could easily be framed for his death. At the very least, whoever is behind this horrendous act would make sure that relations between Austria and Byzantium weaken because of this. Do you even have a suspect in mind? Andronikos struggled to come up with a response to this question. Eventually, he only said one word, the man's identity, who he believed to be the perpetrator. Dissentious. When Lind heard this, she was pretty surprised. After all, as far as the intelligence she received showed, all of the emperor's children were extremely close with Arethes, especially Dissentious. If the second prince was responsible for the stratego's death, that meant something serious had to have occurred. With this in mind, Lind naturally began to investigate Andronikos' claims. Why would Dissentious betray Arethes? As far as I know, the man was practically a father to the second prince. When Andronikos heard this, he immediately began to back up his claims with his reasoning. Dissentious was tasked with finding the missing princess. After he failed to do so, he fell from the good graces of his father, and by extension, those who were backing him in his attempt to gain the throne. If he could not locate a simple runaway, then how could he properly run the empire? Or so was the thought of the people backing him. He needed a grand achievement to recover the losses that Honoria had caused him, and as such, he took credit for the North African campaign. The only way to do so was to kill off Arethes, take Cairo for himself, and rewrite the narrative. When Lind heard this, she stared at Andronikos with disbelief. Such a plan was quite foolish. After all, there would undoubtedly be witnesses to Dissentious's betrayal. But then again, when she took into account all of the foolishness that Lambert had engaged in with his attempt to depose Berengar, she began to realize that maybe second sons were simply idiotic by nature. She contemplated these words for some time before revealing her thoughts on the matter. Let's say that all of this is true, and Dissentious is as big as a fuck-up as Lambert. You still haven't answered the most important question of all. Andronikos looked at Lind with confusion as the woman calmly took a sip from her coffee cup. When Lind saw this, she sighed before repeating her question from earlier. What does Austria stand to gain from investigating Arethes' death? When Andronikos heard this question repeated, he felt quite wounded. He had always thought of Lind and Berengar as friends of Arethes and his household. He never expected the woman before him to act so coldly in response to the news he had brought her. As such, he sighed heavily before once more checking his surroundings to see if anyone was listening in on them. After confirming that nobody could hear them, he leaned over and whispered in Linda's ear. I know you are harboring the princess. I also know that Berengar has taken quite a liking to her. Tell me, is she pregnant yet? When Lind heard this, she was shocked to the core. After all, she and her intelligence agency had gone through great lengths to cover up any information regarding Honoria's identity. However, Lind was a professional, and as such, she maintained a calm facade as she responded, despite her heart beating rapidly. I have no idea what you are talking about. In response to this, Andronikos leaned back in his chair with a broad smile on his face. Though Lind was convincing, to the point that he almost believed it himself, he was on good authority that the Byzantine princess was one of Berengar's lovers. As such, he demonstrated his knowledge thoroughly. White hair, pale skin, mint green eyes, gorgeous appearance. She's going by the name Valeria Zonera now. Or is it Valeria Maladia? After all, maintaining the appearance of a pirate queen and a Byzantine noblewoman is not something that can be done with a single identity. When Lind heard this, she knew that Andronikos was not simply bluffing. As such, she inquired about his source of knowledge. How did you know? Andronikos chuckled as he heard this before responding to Linda's question. You are not the only one with an extensive spy network, sweetheart. I'll admit you covered your tracks well. I almost didn't believe it at first, if it weren't for the fact that Arethes had written me a letter about his regrets regarding the princess, informing me of the conversation he had with her the last time he saw her. Then I would have never suspected you, and Berengar to be involved. When Lind heard this, she sighed heavily before admitting defeat. As such, she inquired about Andronikos' intentions. So you intend to blackmail us into supporting your cause? When Andronikos heard this, he was genuinely offended. As such, he put down his coffee and sat up straight as he revealed his offer to Lind. The thought honestly never crossed my mind. I am not your enemy, Lind, you should know that by now. What I offer you is something mutually beneficial to our two realms. There are men in the Empire, powerful men, who are not fond of either Decentius or his older brother Alexius. Don't even get me started on the youngest of the Emperor's sons. In the simplest terms, he is a lustful drunk who is more interested in hedonism than ruling the Empire. He would turn the palace into his personal brothel and bring an era of decline upon Byzantium. With this in mind, my supporters seek an alternative option for the succession crisis we currently face. Quote, when Lind heard this, she scoffed at Andronikos' statement. So what, they want to put Honoria on the throne? In response to this, Andronikos shook his head and revealed his true intentions. Not even close, but the son of the King of Austria and the only Byzantine princess? That is an appealing concept to my new master. You may not realize it, but your so-called husband has caught the attention of the entire world. Annexing the Swiss Confederation? Allying with Granada? Creating a bunch of proxy wars so that the church has its hands full? Those are some bold moves. We have been watching the West's wars for some time now. The dominance Austria displays under Berengar's rule is unreal. If left unchecked, I would not be surprised if a new empire forms in the West, rivaling that of Rome. What your husband does in Europe is of no concern to our empire, and my backers want to make a lasting alliance with your man. After all, we are sure that our two realms are better off as partners than as enemies. Of course, the faction backing the other two candidates views Austria as a threat, especially now that it has a powerful navy. They will stop at nothing to prevent your rapid growth. With the help of the men behind me, we can convince the Emperor to make Honoria one of Berengar's wives. After all, his intentions of legalizing polygamy have become quite apparent. When she gives birth to a son, he will rule the East one day, while Berengar's heir will rule the West. By helping us investigate Aretha's death, you also help your husband create a powerful ally. As for what you personally gain from this, isn't it obvious? You gain the upper hand in the war for your husband's affection. What do you say? Are you interested now? Lind thought about it for several moments in silence as she gracefully sipped down the rest of her coffee. After careful consideration, she made a decision, as such a pretty smile formed on her have as she declared her intentions. All right, I'll play along. Chapter 334 Papal Woes. Deep within the halls of the Vatican, Pope Julius was sitting upon his papal throne. As he did so, he held his head within his hands. The man was so thoroughly enraged that he felt like he was about to suffer an aneurysm. The war between the Holy Roman Empire and the newfound Kingdom of Austria had turned into an enormous disaster. To calm his nerves, Julius breathed in and exhaled a few times. As he did so, he made a snarky comment about his current condition. So this is how Valentinian felt right before he died? This was a reference to the ancient Roman emperor who had gotten so irritated that he suffered a stroke and thus quite literally died of anger. No matter how much the Pope tried to calm his nerves, he could not help but think of the setbacks that the Church was currently facing due to Berengar's rapid rise to power. The Italians were swiftly being pushed back to Florence, which was the seat of imperial power, and the Swiss Confederation had surrendered, becoming annexed by the Austrians in the process. Due to this fact, between 10 and 20,000 Austrians would be heading to the Italian theater of war to crush the Italian army thoroughly. The pillar of papal military power was the might that the Holy Roman Empire possessed. Only now did the Pope realize the mistakes that he had made when the Hussite wars broke out. He should have sent the Catholic armies into Austria the moment he was able to do so and root out the avatar of Satan that was King Berengar von Kufstein. King? What gave him the right to call himself that? The Pope did not crown him, and as such, Julius did not recognize the legitimacy of Berengar's newfound title. Regardless of this alleged illegitimacy, Julius could not deny that Berengar had truly outplayed him. Berengar had done the unthinkable and used his neighbors and allies as a proxy to hamper the Catholic kingdoms and their military might. In doing so, he had pretended to be at peace but instead was preparing an army the likes the world had never seen before. Not just an army, but a powerful enough navy to challenge the Holy Roman Empire and its vassal states on the Mediterranean. Before the Italians could even respond to Berengar's navy, the demon had sent his armada to eradicate the majority of their fleet. This attack was launched without warning as the vessels were docked in their two most important port cities, crippling the massive fleet they had built up in preparation for the war. All of these things made the Vicar of Christ, of all people, question his faith in the Lord God Almighty. Was Berengar not the serpent in the flesh? Was he actually an envoy of God's will sent to deliver Christendom from the corruption that had consumed the Roman Catholic Church? If not, then how could Berengar triumph against his enemies over and over again without suffering? Such thoughts plagued the mind of the new pope, who had to inherit the mess his predecessor created. Damn you, Simeon, damn you to the depths of hell. What kind of monster have you provoked against our faith? Julius could not help but curse the previous pope who was forced to vacate his position after the disaster he had caused in the German realm. While the Germans slaughtered one another for a meaningless title, Bohemia was in an even worse state. With each passing day, the Hussites gained further ground within Bohemia. Somehow, recently captured Hussite arms had made their way into the hands of murderers and thieves, causing the Bohemian people to lose faith in their king. Roddick, what the hell are you doing? King of Bohemia, and yet you can't prevent your soldiers from selling captured rebel arms to a bunch of brigands. Bah, you don't deserve your title. Despite being alone, Julius could not prevent himself from venting his frustrations in the darkness surrounding him. If one were to enter the chambers, they would see a lonely old pope sitting on his throne in the dark, cursing at people who were hundreds or even thousands of miles away. If there was one good thing that had happened during this time, it was the fact that the Emirate of Granada had recently been suffering setbacks in their war with the Iberian Union, and the fact that various designs of the so-called arquebus and musket had been captured by the papacy's allies, and thus brought to them for reverse engineering. Indeed, God was testing his patience, but it would all be worth it when they finally managed to figure out how Berengar's weapons worked. Once they did, they could gather together a grand army of crusaders the likes the world had never seen before and march on Austria with the weapons that Berengar had created. It was not just matchlocks and flintlocks that the church had acquired, but falconets too. Compared to Berengar's defenses, such cannons were severely obsolete. It did not change the fact that they finally had access to more sophisticated artillery. Maybe they could even produce a gun based upon the one-pounder falconet that was scaled up in size? Undoubtedly Berengar had received the visions of such designs from Satan himself. Despite the demonic origins of these devices, the church had no choice but to employ them against their greatest enemy, for if they continued to attack Austria in the same manner that they had been conducting warfare, there was only one outcome: utter defeat. Like it or not, Berengar was right when he said the era of knights and chivalry had come to an end. If only they could get their hands on one of Berengar's vessels, maybe they could figure out how such things function and then be able to reproduce it. Unfortunately, such an outcome was unlikely to occur. As the Pope was dwelling upon such possibilities, a cardinal entered the Great Hall, where he immediately approached Julius with a letter in his hand. "Your Holiness, we have received word from the Patriarch of Constantinople." When Julius heard this, he looked up from the ground where he had been staring at and into the eyes of the cardinal. As he did so, he scoffed before insulting his equal to the east. So that coward finally responds to our demands. It took him long enough. Tell me what exactly is the response that Petrus has given us. The cardinal shifted his feet in anxiety while gazing down at the stone floor. After a few moments of silence, Julius raised his voice before giving him a command. Speak. Upon hearing the anger in the Pope's voice, the cardinal instantly blurted out the words contained in the letter. The Patriarch of Constantinople has declared that the Orthodox Church will not be sending us aid in our efforts to crush the Berengar heresy and has openly declared the so-called German Reformation as a legitimate branch of Christianity. By decree of Emperor Vitranes, the Byzantine Empire expresses support for the Kingdom of Austria and recognizes its legitimacy. The moment the Holy Father heard this, he felt as if his brain were about to explode. He stood there in silence for a few moments as his face twitched with wrath. Never in a million years did he think that his allies in the East would stab him in the back like this. After well over a minute had passed, the Pope broke out into a fit of rage as he cursed the Patriarch of Constantinople. Excommunicated, that damn bastard, and the entire Orthodox Church is henceforth excommunicated and damned to the depths of hell for all eternity. Fucking apostates. If you side with heretics, then you shall be treated as such. The cardinal was surprised by this response, and he quite honestly felt it was unjustifiable. However, he held his tongue. Knowing the stress that the Pope had been going through with the difficulties the Church was facing at the moment was enough to convince the cardinal from invoking the Holy Father's ire any further. As such, he bowed his head and responded obediently to the Vicar of Christ. I will prepare a public announcement. If you are going through with this, then a schism between our two churches is unavoidable. I hope you have thought this through. With this said, the cardinal swiftly left the room, fearing retaliation for his words, leaving the Pope alone in the dark, who once more sat upon his throne. After the cardinal had left and silence prevailed within the Great Hall of the Vatican, the Pope began to grind his teeth before cursing once more. Berengar von Kufstein, if you had known your place and submitted to the Church, you may have been spared. However, for what you have done and what you will do, you can never be forgiven. Even if it is the death of me, I will bring you to your knees and restore the authority of the Vatican over Christendom. Chapter 335 Ghost Town. Nearly a month had passed since the swift victory in Milan, and Berengar's army had waited for reinforcement and resupply before marching on the city of Parma. At the moment, the Jaeger Corps had a few hundred men issued with the new Schmidt needle rifle, though the ratio of men armed with the needle rifle and the traditional muzzle-loading Jaeger rifle was roughly 1 to 3. As for the rest of Berengar's army, they were still outfitted with the 1,417 18ths rifled muskets. However, compared to the enemy they were facing, such weapons were more than enough to massacre any army they would encounter. The Jaeger Corps had done their jobs and led the way to Parma. In doing so, they encountered little resistance. It became increasingly apparent that the Italian soldiers still in the field had begun to disobey their orders and flee from the lost cause that was their war with Austria. At the moment, the city of Parma could be seen in the distance. However, something was noticeably lacking in Berengar's mind as he gazed through his binoculars into the distance. Upon the city walls, as far as he could tell, there were no defenders stationed on the ramparts. This was quite shocking, as every city was supposed to have a garrison defending it, especially in times of war. Yet, the more he observed the walls, the more he found them vacant of any form of military presence. With this in mind, Berengar gave an order to his colonel Dietrich of the Jaeger Corps. Send a few of your men to scale the walls and see what they can find out about the current situation within the city. Have your other men cover them from the tree line. With this said, Dietrich nodded his head before giving his most elite troops the orders. Some might consider this a suicide mission, but Berengar did not want to walk into a trap. As for the rest of his army, they immediately became alert and fixed their bayonets in preparation for the event of an ambush. Corporal Latch and his squad were the ones deployed to scale the wall. Despite having the assurance that they were being protected by the elite marksmen of the Jaeger Corps, they still felt a sense of gut-wrenching anxiety as they rapidly approached the walls. However, by the time they arrived at the base of the city's defenses, they had not been fired upon by the defenders or the lack thereof. Therefore, they quickly pulled out their grappling hooks tied to hemp rope and tossed them onto the ramparts above. After checking to see if the rope was secure, the men slung their rifles over their backs before climbing up the rope and onto the ramparts above. The moment they did so, they quickly equipped their weapons and searched for any sign of hostility. However, they were utterly and genuinely alone atop these walls, which greatly confused the small squad of Jaegers. As such, the squad leader immediately gave the order to his soldiers. "Pull out your binoculars and survey the city. See what you can find." With this command given, the squad of Jaegers did as instructed. However, when they looked down at the city below, they were shocked at what they saw. There was not the slightest sign of occupation within the city. Throughout the entirety of Parma, there was not a living soul to be found. It was as if the residents of the city had just abandoned it overnight, which was shocking to the soldiers. After inspecting the town within the walls for some time, the squad leader issued another command. "We will rappel down the walls and open the gates. Be cautious, this might be a trap." The various soldiers beneath the squad leader's command, including Corporal Latch, nodded their heads before doing as instructed. After reaching the ground, they unslung their rifles once more and performed a proper sweep of the street leading to the gate. Despite this, they indeed found nobody within the city's walls. As such, they suffered no resistance when they finally opened the gates. When the gates opened and the Jaeger soldiers within waved the flag of Austria, Berengar was deeply concerned. Not a single gunshot had echoed in the distance as the men entered the city. Despite this, the city gates were opened effortlessly, and his Jaegers appeared utterly unharmed. Berengar could not fathom what game the Italians were playing, but considering this, he decided to investigate. With this in mind, he gave a command to his officers, who relayed his orders throughout his massive army. "We will enter the city's gates, but be on alert. This may very well be a trap." After hearing their orders, the Austrian host advanced into the abandoned city in an attempt to thoroughly investigate just what was going on. After approaching the city gates, Berengar began to speak with his Jaegers, who were the first to enter the scene. Status report. Immediately the squad leader saluted the king before reporting what he knew about the current situation. "Your Majesty, we have observed the city for some time with our binoculars to find not a single trace of habitation. Either everyone is quietly hiding within the walls of the city, or it has been completely abandoned." Upon hearing this, Berengar was shocked. Even for a small city like this, it would take some time and effort to withdraw every living being from within and relocate them entirely. Though they had waited roughly a month for reinforcements to arrive, it still seemed unlikely that every citizen had fled the city in such a period of time. As such, Berengar gave his decree to the army. "Tear this city apart. I want to find out what has happened here. Remember, this still might be a trap." With this in mind, the Austrian soldiers began to kick down every door in the city where they searched for people, wealth, or clues as to what had transpired. Because the city had been rapidly evacuated, many things of value were left behind, and as such, Berengar and his army could acquire some degree of wealth to bring back to Austria. However, the most crucial form of intelligence came from a letter left within a house. Berengar's spies occupied this small structure. In doing so, they were forced to vacate the city with the rest of the civilians. Before they did so, they left a letter to inform the Royal Austrian Army when they arrived as to what had transpired within the city and others like it across northern Italy. The emperor had made a decree that all cities and villages on the path to Florence must be evacuated, where its people would seek refuge within the capital's mighty walls. The reality behind this decree was that Emperor Balsamo Corsini intended to arm every citizen capable of bearing arms to fight against the Austrian invaders. A wicked smile curved itself upon Berengar's lips as he read the contents of the letter. He could not help but voice his thoughts aloud in a voice so low that only he could hear it. "So, you seek to follow the fate of Carthage? Do you desire for me to exhaust my army as I spend months or years at a time trying to force my way through every corner of your capital in an attempt to root you out and secure victory? Sadly, you have made a grave error. No, my dear Emperor. I have much grander plans in mind for the city of Florence. If God truly exists, then I do not doubt that he will judge me severely for what I am about to do. Unfortunately, you have left me no choice. I will not send my army into a meaningless death. However, I assure you, your city will be the grave of every soul contained within. You have brought this upon yourself." With that said, Berengar pulled out his lighter and lit the letter aflame. After doing so, he waited for his army to gather the wealth left within the city of Parma's walls. Once they were finished, he sent a small convoy to deliver the goods to Austria's treasury. As for the rest of his army, Berengar had chosen a course of action and decided to march directly onto Florence. The war was coming to an end, and Berengar chose to waste no further time sacking the cities within his path. After all, the fortune of the Medicis was far greater than anything he could gain from within the walls of Bologna. As for how he would choose to deal with the city of Florence, only time would tell. However, one thing was sure: he would not allow his soldiers to march into the capital of the empire and engage in a brutal struggle to take every corner of the city from the fierce resistance of the Italians. Chapter 336 Siege of Florence Part 1. Since Berengar and his army had departed from Parma, over a month had passed. Various siege camps were set up encircling the city of Florence where the emperor and the Medicis resided. The Austrians' encampment greatly resembled an elaborate trench line straight out of the pictures from the Great War during Berengar's previous life. During this time, nobody was allowed to enter the city. However, Berengar had successfully exfiltrated his agents trapped in the town. It took some effort, but they were retrieved from their position without incident before the Austrian bombardment had begun. After retrieving his agents, the Royal Austrian Army's cannons fired off shells at an arc, landing over the city walls and into the city, bombarding the inhabitants within. With the hundreds of thousands of people who had evacuated to the town of Florence, Berengar knew it was a matter of months before their food supply dwindled and the people began to starve. While the siege of Florence continued, back in Kufstein, the war industry had spent day and night producing as many needle rifles and their paper cartridges as possible to supply the Austrian war effort. As such, thousands of these rifles were now in the hands of the frontline soldiers who rested in the mud as their extravagant blackened steel armor was coated with the substance, covering their armor and attire in an earthly brown. For the past 3 days, it had been raining non-stop. For the rear echelon soldiers who were still issued the flintlock rifles, they could only keep their weapons dry under the thatched coverings of the vast trench line. As for the men with needle rifles, they stayed in the front lines, ready to fire on any potential targets that might sally forth and attack their ranks. Despite the weeks of constant bombardment, the city still stood, resisting Berengar's armies until the bitter end. As such, Berengar had taken a relaxed approach and had begun writing letters back home to his loved ones. It was a way to entertain himself during this protracted siege. The echoes of hundreds of cannons continued to go off as Berengar wrote with his ink and quill to his beloved Adela, who he knew to be staying in Kufstein. The years had gone by since he was first engaged to the girl, and she was now of the proper age to marry. With this in mind, Berengar wrote to his little fiancée, expressing his desire to return home from the field and finally take her hand in marriage. She was his fiancée, his queen, and the first among his wives, and nothing could change that fact. While he was writing a love letter to his woman, a knock on the roof of his in-ground quarters resounded throughout the room. Berengar looked over to see one of his officers, clad in the Renaissance-style attire, standing at attention. Berengar, dressed in an equally garish fashion, albeit covered in dried mud, stood from his seat and returned the salute to the soldier. The moment he did so, the officer began giving his report. "Your Majesty, the bombardments are continuing as planned. By now, half of the city should be in ruin. I believe it is only a matter of time before they surrender." Despite this report, Berengar did not seem optimistic. On 3 separate occasions, the enemy army had rushed their trench line over the past month. The result was a complete and utter slaughter of the Italian forces. With the relatively rapid-firing needle rifles capable of functioning even in adverse conditions, the one advantage that the Italians would typically have over the flintlock firearms was now moot. However, the number of needle rifles among his ranks was still significantly less than his entire infantry. As such, the Italians had at times inflicted casualties upon Berengar's ranks by the sheer volume of bodies they were able to field. Generally speaking, they would attack during days like this, days where the weather prevented the bulk of Berengar's forces from firing their weapons. They would appear in the tens of thousands and overwhelm Berengar's ranks through reckless charges. While the man was giving his report, a bell rang throughout the trench line. This bell signaled the enemy attack. As such, Berengar quickly grabbed a hold of his helmet before placing it upon his head. After doing so, he grabbed his needle rifle and loaded a cartridge in its chamber. Once he was complete with his actions, he gave a smug look to the officer who had moments ago predicted the Italians' surrender before making a wise-ass remark. "You were saying, Colonel?" The expression on the man's face turned sour as he heard Berengar's words. he truly believed the Italians would realize that the cause was lost and would surrender. Unfortunately for him, that was not the case, and now they were being thrust headfirst into another battle. With this in mind, Berengar exited his quarters and climbed up into the muddy trench, where he began to rush towards the area of conflict. For Berengar, this was most likely the last opportunity he had to fight a battle with relative safety. After all, the Austrian weapons were so advanced that Berengar could fight on the front lines with mitigated risk to his safety. As such, he decided to spend one last hurrah on the battlefield before becoming a commander who forever sat at the rear of battle. Having arrived at the front lines, Berengar and the soldiers around him lowered their weapons and aimed at the oncoming Italians. Like last time, there were well over 20,000 men and adolescent boys charging at the Austrian trench, utterly devoid of armor and at most held a spear in their hands. Berengar did not know what propaganda the emperor had filled in the heads of his people to have them fight without regard to their lives. However, it truly did not matter. At the end of the day, these men and boys alike were enemies, and they had to be dealt with. The Italian attacks always came in the form of waves, targeting specific trench lines. As such, the thousands of Austrians capable of firing in the raining weather were spread out and vastly outnumbered. The moment Berengar spotted an Italian man at a distance of roughly 1,000 yards, he squeezed the trigger on his needle rifle, sending a projectile downrange and into his bare chest, blasting it apart. The men gazed in horror as he was shot at such a distance before falling to the ground lifeless. Before the body had even hit the ground, Berengar reloaded his needle rifle by pulling the bolt up and back, where he instantly placed a paper cartridge within the chamber before slamming the bolt home. While he was doing this, several other of his soldiers fired their weapons into the ranks of the oncoming enemy. If it were not for the barbed wire in the field halting the Italian advance, they would have reached the front lines by now. Thousands of guns echoed at the front line as hundreds of Austrian soldiers from the other trench positions rushed towards Berengar and his troops for reinforcement. While reinforcements struggled to arrive, Berengar once more fired his rifle towards the enemy as the .451 caliber projectile pierced through the skull of a boy no older than 14. Berengar rapidly chambered his next round. However, when he pulled the trigger, all that could be heard was an audible click. With paper cartridges, the malfunction rate was roughly 1 out of every 14 rounds. As such, he pulled back the bolt before reaching for his clearing rod, which was attached beneath the bar. After getting a hold of the device, he stuck it down the bore of the rifle and knocked the faulty cartridge loose. Having done so, Berengar put the clearing rod back in its place before reaching into his webgear, where he retrieved another paper cartridge and chambered it into the rifle, where he pushed the bolt forward. After doing so, he aimed and fired another round, only to miss his target by a mere inch. The lead alloy projectile embedded itself in the man's shoulder rather than his torso. Though painful, it was not a mortal blow. Before long, the Italian army had suffered massive casualties, as half of their forces were gunned down during their suicidal charge, but this did not deter their actions. Instead, they ran into the trench line where the Austrian soldiers unleashed their bayonets onto the enemy. Luckily for the Austrian soldiers, these enemies were mere peasant levies quickly drafted into combat at a moment's notice. They had no armor, and thus the Austrian blade-style bayonets easily pierced through their torsos, sending them to the afterlife. Berengar himself quickly caught an oncoming spear and redirected it with his rifle before lunging forward and piercing his bayonet through the man's heart. After seeing the life fade from the man's eyes, the young king ruthlessly ripped it out and attacked the next hostile. This battle continued until eventually the Italian army of nearly 20,000 men was repelled. As the survivors ran back towards the relative safety of the city's walls, they were gunned down by Berengar's men who fired upon their retreat, claiming the lives of nearly all of the men who attempted the suicidal charge. Seeing that they were victorious, Berengar let out a sigh of relief before clearing his rifle and taking off his helmet, resting his slicked-backed golden hair against the muddy wall of the trench. Combat was truly and utterly exhausting. Despite being victorious in this large skirmish, the siege of Florence was far from over. As Berengar rested against the wall of the trench line, with rain falling heavily upon his handsome face, he could not help but think of his plans for the future after this war was over. When he had finally defeated the Empire and gained his independence, he would usher in the early stages of the Age of Steam. He had honestly waited long enough. Chapter 337 Siege of Florence Part 2. After that day where Berengar and his army had fought off the Italian charge, things went back to their usual pacing. The rain finally dispersed, and soon the muddied trenches dried up, allowing the Austrian soldiers still issued flintlock rifles to use their weapons properly. Rain was replaced with snow as winter soon fell upon the city of Florence, and thus the Austrian army was now dressed in its winter clothing, who were struggling with each day to endure the cold and harsh life of sustaining a large-term siege while living in a trench. Another month had passed, and during this time frame, the Italians had seldom made an advance. Despite this, the Austrian army continued to shell the city every day for several hours at a time. If not for Berengar's established supply routes, and the empty cities behind him, he would have had a hard time maintaining the number of shells needed to bombard the town. The thunder of the guns echoed off as the hundreds of cannons alternated fire, ensuring that a battery was fired nearly every second during the time frame Berengar had set for bombardments. Seeing how the artillery pieces were elevated at varying degrees, the projectiles flew over the walls and into the city below. The citizens within Florence found their homes destroyed, and their lives were taken during this process. In fact, by now, Berengar's army had fired hundreds of thousands of shells into the city. He was beginning to wonder if there was anyone left alive within Florence. After all, it had been some time since the Italians had rushed his position. If not for the roughly 3 years spent preparing for this war, Berengar likely would have run out of munitions ages ago. At the moment, Berengar was within the rearmost region of the trench line, where his quarters were built into the ground. He was shaving, as it was now light enough out for him to do so. The straight razor cut at the hairs growing on his face and neck as he began to break out into laughter. If one were to observe him, it would appear as if he had gone mad. Still, Berengar was currently reminded of an incident from a particular science fiction franchise from his previous life where soldiers bombarded a city for years after everyone inside was long dead. Having nearly cut his throat while laughing at this prospect, Berengar quickly calmed himself and finished the task at hand. After doing so, he decided he would check to see if anyone was alive within Florence. As such, he cleaned himself up before grabbing a hold of his burgonet, where he placed it upon his head. He then grabbed his needle rifle and exited his quarters, where he entered the trenches. Within the trenches, it became apparent that the men within had endured quite a bit of difficulty over this past 2 months of siege warfare. However, it was nothing compared to the poor souls who suffered through the Great War from his previous life. After all, Berengar's army was not subject to bombardment by the city's defenders. Eventually, Berengar made his way to the mess constructed for his general officers to dine in. Seeing them eating their morning supply of breakfast brought a smile to Berengar's face. The moment they saw the king arrive, they jumped up from their seats and saluted him, where Berengar immediately responded with the command. At ease, after the men relaxed, Berengar approached the general tasked with leading his 5 artillery brigades and began to discuss his newest plan. I think it is about time to bring down the walls. Have your brigade within our trench line focus their fire on the northern wall until it crumbles. I'd like to see if there is anyone left alive in the city. After hearing this order, the general nodded before responding. Yes, Your Majesty, I will relay your orders immediately. With that said, Berengar nodded in approval, thus dismissing the man where he ran off to inform the artillery units of their new orders. Shortly after that, the bombardment had begun once more, as the shells whistled in the air and exploded onto the northern wall. While this barrage had begun, Berengar had given the infantry generals new orders as well. Prepare our soldiers. We are entering the city. The time has come to conclude this war and secure our independence. For glory and fatherland, God with us. After hearing this, the infantry generals jumped up in response as they saluted Berengar. For king and fatherland. Afterward, Berengar dismissed them, where they began to muster the army that had spent the last 2 months living in the trenches, waiting for this very moment. After roughly an hour, the northern wall had collapsed, and with it, the city of Florence, or what remained of it, was revealed. Berengar stood at the front of his army with his sword drawn as he gave a brief but rousing speech. Let today forever be known as the day that Austria gained its independence from the empire. Whatever difficulties you may face, know that Austria stands behind you. God with us. Thousands of men instantly echoed the Austrian battle cry as they began to advance. The sight of tens of thousands of Austrian soldiers emerging from the trenches with their rifles in hand and their bayonets affixed as they charged towards the ruined city was indeed one to behold. Berengar allowed the army to pass him by as he took a rear position in the army. The days of him charging into the front lines of war had long since passed. Though he might take an offensive role in the trenches, he would no longer be the first to storm a city. Thus he followed the army from the rear as they breached through the gap between the northern walls, only to see a scale of death and destruction he had never witnessed before. After months of bombardment and hundreds of thousands of shells dropped into the city, few buildings were left standing. Most of Florence had been crumbled into debris, and the people within the city walls were either torn apart by the explosive shells or crushed to death by the collapsed buildings. Month-old corpses littered the streets as they festered and rotted. Berengar now understood why the Italians had not sent a force to attack his line in weeks. The reason was simple: there was no one left to send. Despite the utter destruction brought upon the city of Florence, Berengar's army was as always professional. As such, they cautiously cleared the streets while marching upon the imperial palace, and more importantly, the Medici Bank. Every so often, the soldiers of the Royal Austrian Army would clear through debris and find a few citizens hiding within their cellars, assuming their house had won. Many of them had long since died of starvation. Others had managed to survive, potentially through drastic measures. However, these shell-shocked survivors offered no resistance to the army that had brought death upon their lands. Berengar personally led his troops into the now ravaged Medici Bank. Not a single soul was left alive within the structure, though it had been hit by shells and collapsed in some areas. By the grace of God, it had mostly survived the massive bombardment that Berengar had unleashed upon the city. Berengar slowly walked through the halls of the bank with a calm and collected expression on his face. He was flanked by his grenadier, who guarded him cautiously. Eventually, he reached the vault where the Medici fortune was contained, where his soldiers used TNT to breach the entrance. After entering the vault, Berengar gazed upon the massive hoard of gold and silver coins stacked as high as the ceiling. Berengar never imagined the Medici wealth to be so grand. Gazing upon such a vast stockpile of gold and silver flipped a switch in Berengar's brain. Gold was a substance like no other. Compared to the material strengths of steel, it was a far less practical metal. However, the effect it had on a man's mind was like no other. Seeing such a massive pile of gold coins gathered in one place that was potentially greater than his fortune made Berengar break out in mad laughter. After nearly a minute of laughter, Berengar began to cough heavily before calming himself down. After doing so, he uttered a few words. To think that the Medici wealth was so much more than I was led to believe. Truly, it is a fortune to rival that of Mansa Musa, and now it is all mine. With this wealth, I can transform the Austrian economy into the greatest the world has ever seen. Seeing the manic expression on Berengar's face and the words he had spoken filled his guard with a slight sense of trepidation. However, eventually, Berengar recovered before giving out his orders to the grenadier. Guard this treasure trove. Once we have finished securing the city, we will haul it all back to Kufstein, where it will be melted down and reminted into our currency. With this said, the vast fortune of the Medici family had found its way into the hands of the von Kufstein dynasty, and by extension, the Kingdom of Austria. With this wealth, Berengar would use it to stimulate his economy and break the stagnation that it had begun to suffer due to the limited quantities of the precious metals that he severely lacked until now. Though Berengar was unaware of what fate awaited the Medici family, whether they were killed off from the bombardment or fled the city, leaving their fortune behind, it did not matter. One thing was certain: the vast wealth of the Medici Bank that had once funded the Catholic Church was now acquired by their greatest enemy. Due to this fact, the Church's ability to wage war against Berengar was crippled for years to come, buying him several years of much-needed peace to industrialize his kingdom and its military. Chapter 338: The Holy Roman Empire surrenders. After securing the Medici Bank and its vast fortune, Berengar personally led his troops to the crumbling imperial palace, which was Emperor Balsamo Corsini's personal home within the city of Florence. Much like the Medici Bank, only parts of the building were collapsed. However, it remained intact for the most part. The Austrian artillery was more trained than Berengar had initially thought. In contrast, he had given them instructions to spare the Medici Bank and the imperial palace. He never thought they would manage to achieve it. Nearly everything within the city had been completely obliterated, with few exceptions. Berengar was quite impressed with how effective his artillery was, despite its primitive nature. He could only imagine the destruction he could cause if he were equipped with more modern equipment like rifled breech-loading cannons. Berengar thought about this as he strolled through the ruins of Florence. The roads, the houses, the public baths, the cultural icons, everything within the city had been smashed into ruin by the overwhelming bombardment of artillery shells that Berengar had launched onto the city over the past couple of months. So much so that Berengar felt saddened, not for the loss of life, but the destruction of history that had occurred in such an ancient and magnificent city. Though he was not a historian by trade in his past life, he was highly knowledgeable on the subject and had a passion for it. To see his war cause such devastation to the city that was supposed to play a prominent role in the Renaissance nearly brought a tear to the young monarch's eye as he marched ever closer to the palace. Eventually, Berengar reached the crumbling steps of the dilapidated imperial palace. Upon closer inspection, it seemed to be in a very fragile state, so much so that he felt it could collapse at any moment. With this in mind, he sent his soldiers in to investigate the building before he entered. If the emperor were wise, he would have fled to the wine cellar, as that was his best chance of survival. As such, Berengar's troops quickly advanced through the building, making sure each room was clear of potential hostiles. They did not find a single living soul within the upper levels, though there were a few corpses of guards and servants that the collapsed parts of the building had crushed. Yet, none resembled the description of the emperor. Eventually, Berengar's soldiers found the entrance to the cellar. It was a long staircase that led some ways underground. As such, the unit sent a soldier out to inform Berengar of their discovery. The young soldier was clad in the basic blackened plate armor, with the flashy attire beneath it. However, it had been thoroughly stained with grime from the months of trench warfare that the man had endured, and as such, his uniform looked as if it would blend in with the mud. "Your Majesty, the building is clear, aside from the cellar. With your permission, we will breach its entrance and see if we can find any sign of the emperor and his family." Berengar silently nodded his head as he followed the soldier back inside, where he gave the order to the veteran grenadier who made up his bodyguard. "If the emperor and his family are still breathing, I want them captured alive. As for any other survivors, do whatever you feel to be necessary." After saying this, an entire squad of grenadier went down the staircase. Shortly after, Berengar began his descent, where along the way, he heard gunshots resound from the cellar below. With this in mind, he quickly made his way into the basement, where he found the emperor and his family cowered in the corner, their last bodyguards lying dead on the ground, bleeding from the bullet wounds that tore their chests apart. They were shot dead by the Austrian grenadier. As such, Berengar quickly asked for a status report from the squad leader. "What happened here?" The grenadier instantly saluted Berengar before describing the events that had transpired mere moments before. "We came into the room as we were ordered. Immediately upon entering, the guards rushed at us with their blades, so we gunned them down. Do not worry, Your Majesty, the Emperor and his family has been spared." Upon hearing this, Berengar remained silent as he nodded in affirmation of the grenadier's actions. After doing so, he slowly approached the Emperor, who was kneeling while shivering in fright like a small child. Berengar proceeded to stand in front of the man with a wicked grin on his face. Every word uttered by Berengar came from a position of overwhelming strength, as if he were bullying the weak. "Emperor Balsamo Corsini, I must say, this is the first time meeting you in person, and yet I am dreadfully underwhelmed. I thought for sure a man of your position would have the courage to stand before me, yet here you are kneeling like a cowardly child. Allow me to make things simple for you. Your armies are broken, your capital is in ruins, and your wealth now belongs to me. You have nothing left. This is the result of your actions and yours alone. My demands are simple. The Kingdom of Austria shall henceforth be an independent nation, and the empire will recognize its legitimacy. You shall also recognize Austria's annexation of the Swiss Confederation. Everything north of Rome and Sardinia shall henceforth become the Kingdom of Lombardy and will be established as a protectorate beneath the suzerainty of Austria, where they will provide a tribute to their new masters in the form of currency and raw materials. They shall be allowed a standing army of no more than 10,000 soldiers to act solely as a means of defense. Malta will be ceded to Austria, where all current residents will be evacuated from the island and returned to the Italian mainland. As for the rest of Italy, it will remain in the hands of you and your dynasty, and you are free to do as you wish with it, under the stipulation that your empire refrains from attacking my kingdom for the next 5 years. You are to pay us reparations in the form of gold and silver worth a total of 1 million Austrian guldens. This, of course, is on top of the wealth we have seized from the Medici Bank and the cities we have since plundered. I expect this to be paid to Austria within 100 years. The demands that Berengar had made were excessive. For instance, the reparations alone would account for over 30 tons of gold. In Berengar's past life, that would be worth over $1 billion, with a limited amount of gold in Europe in 1421. The sheer volume of payments Berengar was asking from the Holy Roman Empire was enough to ensure that the empire was in debt to Austria for 100 years or more. However, despite the insane demands that Berengar had forced upon him, the emperor was in no position to reject them. His army was utterly annihilated, and his capital was in ruins. If he resisted, the only thing that would happen would be his death. One way or another, Berengar would get what he wanted. As such, the once mighty Holy Roman Emperor nodded his head in defeat, agreeing to the terms presented. At this moment, the Holy Roman Empire had officially surrendered to the Kingdom of Austria. The war for Austrian independence was over, and with it, significant changes were about to occur within Europe. However, at the moment Berengar could not care about such matters, his attention was needed elsewhere. As such, he and his troops departed from the palace. In a few days, he would sign an official peace treaty with the emperor where all of his terms would be written in the contract. Berengar returned to the Medici Bank and watched as his troops began to haul the substantial amount of gold and silver out of the bank and into supply wagons. It would take weeks, possibly even months, to transport all of this wealth back to the Austrian National Treasury in Kufstein. As such, Berengar would leave behind an army of 25,000 men within the ruined city of Florence to ensure that the gold and silver were successfully transported back to Austria. While Berengar's soldiers spent the next few months ensuring the assets gained in the war completed their journey, the young monarch would depart for Kufstein immediately after the treaty was signed. With the war over, the young king had essential matters of state to attend to. Austria had gained a sizable amount of land and wealth from this conflict. Berengar had also crippled the financial backing of his greatest enemy and ensured that his southern rivals could not attack him for a period of 5 years. With these gains, Berengar fully intended to utilize the time and resources he had acquired in this war to bring forth the fires of industry. When he finally returned from Florence, a new age would await the young monarch. The era of steam and steel was about to descend upon the newly found Kingdom of Austria. Chapter 339 Reunited at last. The War of Austrian Independence finally ended, and to nobody's surprise, the Kingdom of Austria was overwhelmingly victorious. After the siege of Florence that left hundreds of thousands of Italians dead, Berengar successfully signed a peace treaty in the ruined city. Those few who were fortunate enough to survive the bombardment would have to deal with Austrian occupation until the total wealth of the Medici family was transferred back to the Austrian royal treasury. As for Berengar, he returned home immediately after the peace treaty was signed between himself and the Holy Roman Emperor. Today was the day he returned to the city of Kufstein, and when he and his soldiers entered the town, they were shocked to see that a large ceremony had been organized in the streets to welcome the heroes of Austria back to the capital. Berengar waved to the crowd on horseback as he stood at the front of the formation, leading them through the city's gates and into the walls. Women from all walks of life had gathered to toss flowers at the feet of the returning veterans who had given their all for a free and independent Austria. Eventually, Berengar's army, or at least those souls who came from Kufstein, reached the city's center, where they broke ranks and returned to their homes. As for Berengar, he approached the walls of the newly constructed royal palace of Austria. After several years of construction and several iterations in designs, the new home for Berengar and his family was finally finished. The result was a massive palace based upon the creation of the Schönbrunn Palace from Berengar's previous life. Over the past few years, Berengar's grand architectural designs had shifted from the style of the Renaissance in nature to that of Baroque. This included not only his palace but also the grand cathedral that was nearly complete. In Berengar's past life, Baroque architecture was created in the early 17th century by the Catholic Church in an attempt to combat the growing Reformation. Berengar thus decided that in this life, he would use the Catholic Church's tactics against them. Thus all of his major architectural feats, such as his palace and the Grand Cathedral of Kufstein, and Adela's efforts to introduce cultural centers such as concert halls and art galleries, were now being constructed in the Baroque style. After gazing upon his finished mighty palace, A smile appeared on Berengar's lips as he passed through the gates handled by a unit of his grenadier and pressed onwards into the palace grounds. After arriving at the fountain in the front of the yard, Berengar noticed Honoria was sitting upon its edge, skimming the surface with her hands. She was not dressed in her usual practical attire. Instead, she was clothed in a mint green and gold dress. She was dolled up in a decent amount of makeup which highlighted her natural beauty. Heraclius, her pet eagle, was perched upon the princess's shoulder and glared at Berengar as he entered the scene. When Berengar saw one of his women who he had not been with for some time, he hopped down from his mount and approached the girl who had not yet noticed his presence. It was only after Heraclius cawed at Berengar that Honoria shifted her attention from the magnificent fountain to that of her lover, who was standing a few feet away from her. She was well aware that Berengar would be arriving home today and thus had waited for him in the palace gardens for well over an hour. After seeing her man, clad in his armor, returning home from the war as a conquering hero, Honoria could not contain her pent-up desire and rushed into Berengar's arms, where she immediately planted a kiss upon his lips. Unlike Lind and Adela, Berengar had worried about Honoria's safety while she was away. However, she was unaware he had spies embedded on her ship who constantly watched over her, and as such, Berengar was always aware of the battles she had fought and the effect she had on the war effort. Despite her immense success in the art of privateering, Berengar never stopped worrying about Honoria's safety. With this in mind, he eagerly accepted her embrace as he began groping at her chest, shoving his hand through the exposed portion of her dress and wrapping it around her substantial bosom. Honoria did not resist in the slightest. Meanwhile, Heraclius hopped off Honoria's shoulder and perched himself upon the fountain, where he shifted his gaze from the passionate display that the couple was engaging in. At this moment, Berengar noticed Honoria's breasts were bigger than they used to be, and as such, he whispered in her ears the following words. "You have grown since our last encounter. I can't wait to see what you look like under that dress." Though Honoria was eager to show off her improved figure, she was unfortunately not able to do so, as after Berengar had said these words, the couple who were immersed in each other's presence heard a sound from a mere few feet away. Ahem. This immediately caused Berengar and Honoria to break up their intimate gestures and search for the origins of the sound. Adela and Lind were standing nearby where Berengar's little fiancée was pouting with her arms crossed, while his other lover smiled with a sultry expression. She, too, wanted to join in on Berengar and Honoria's fun. Unfortunately, Adela was present, so she would not have the ability to do so. Noticing his two other women standing nearby, Berengar shamelessly walked over to Adela and picked her up in the air, swinging her around before planting a kiss on her luscious pink lips. After placing her down, he said the words he knew she wanted to hear the most. "Adela, I missed you so much." Though Adela was still furious that Honoria was the first to greet Berengar upon his arrival, she was no longer mad at him for allowing himself to be taken advantage of. After seeing the cute expression on Adela's face, he patted her head before walking over to Lind, who was biting her lip in jealousy. He immediately grabbed a hold of her and tucked her into his embrace. However, it was far from comfortable due to the massive amount of steel that covered his upper body. Still, Lind enjoyed the hug, where Berengar planted one hand on her plump bottom before kissing her as well. It was only after this that Berengar noticed Henrietta was standing nearby. She was dressed in a pastel pink dress with gold accents and was staring at Berengar with a sheepish expression. Despite being nearly 14 at the moment, the girl was still shy, even around her brother. As such, Berengar let go of Lind and patted Henrietta's head before hugging her. As he did so, Henrietta flushed with embarrassment before whispering in a voice so low Berengar almost didn't hear it. "Welcome home, big brother." After releasing Henrietta, a broad smile spread upon Berengar's lips as he gazed off into the distance at the massive palace that had been constructed for himself and his family. As such, he made a suggestion to the four young women around him. "Shall we head inside? I very much wish to get out of this clunky attire and witness my new home for myself." The four girls all nodded their heads silently before they followed Berengar into the house. Heraclius stayed out in the garden as he watched the small party depart for the building. He shook his head as he did so before taking off in flight. Where he would go and what he would do while his master socialized with her lover and rivals would remain unknown. When Berengar and the girls finally entered the palace, they reacted with different expressions. However, the girls had been living in the exquisite palace for a few weeks now, it was Berengar's first time witnessing such a grand display of luxury in person. He had seen pictures on the internet of various European palaces in his past life, but never had he stepped foot inside one of the magnificent abodes himself. Now he had one of his own, and it was indeed everything he expected it to be. The level of detail that went into its construction did not go unnoticed. As such, he spent some time searching every corner of the mega structure before finally making his way to his room, where he stripped out of his armor and put on some more comfortable attire. After months of brutal warfare, he was finally reunited with his loved ones, and he fully intended to enjoy the moment. After dressing in some comfortable clothing, he spent the rest of the day with his lovers and his sister. As for what occurred in the night, that was left between Honoria, Lind, and Berengar. Despite being of age, Adela chose to wait for her wedding night until she gave her chastity to the man she loved. To a religious girl like her, some things were sacred. Chapter 340 Coronation of a King Part 1. Nearly a fortnight had passed since Berengar had returned home from the war for Austrian independence. After securing a complete and total victory over the empire, Berengar and his armies had completely shocked the European world with their brutal efficiency during the conflict. Not only did Berniger secure a flawless victory on land, but he even managed to annihilate the massive armada that belonged to the Kingdom of Italy and its vassal states on the sea. However, Berengar did not care about the reputation of cruelty he had gained after his immense success during the war. Instead, he spent the last few weeks preparing for a significant occasion, one that would mark the beginning of a new age in Austria and its vassal state. The coronation ceremony of King Berengar von Kufstein was finally at hand, and Berengar had invited every prominent nobleman in the Kingdom of Austria and his allies from the east and west. As the weeks passed, his visitors had arrived in the hundreds, and now the day for his ceremony had come. At the moment, Berengar was entertaining his guests in the great hall of his new royal palace. The degree of luxury within Berengar's new abode put every other monarch's home in the Western world to shame. Berengar drank from a chalice filled with fortified wine to entertain his friend and ally Sultan Hassan al-Fadl. They had traveled from Granada to attend the coronation ceremony of his partner to the east. At the two monarchs' sides were a string of beautiful young women. Berengar was flanked by his lovers and younger sister. On Hassan's peripheral were his two wives and his older sister Yasmin. They were all dressed in the formal attire of their countries and quite luxurious clothing at that. Hassan was the first to speak as he introduced his gorgeous older sister to Berengar. "My friend, it is good to see that you are finally a monarch in your own right. You are truly deserving of such a position. Allow me to introduce my beautiful older sister Princess Yasmin al-Fadl. I believe I have mentioned her to you in the past, yes?" Berengar was stunned when he saw the woman standing before him. She was dressed in a Tyrian purple caftan embellished with gold embroidery. She also wore a matching face veil that was translucent, as such Berengar could roughly see the outlines of the woman's pretty face. While enamored with the foreign beauty, Berengar did not notice Adela and Lind glaring at him with murderous intent. As such, he grabbed a hold of the woman's hand and kissed it before speaking to the woman. "Princess, it is an honor to make your acquaintance." The foreign beauty smiled beneath her veil before Berengar released his grip over her hand. She, too, was quite attracted to the Austrian king. She had heard much from Hassan about his ally to the east, and until now, she had hardly believed her brother's words. While Adela and Lind were glaring daggers at Berengar from behind, Honoria observed the color of the woman's dress. The young princess from Byzantium was quite enamored with the Tyrian purple caftan. After all, she had acquired and sold an ample supply of the expensive dye for a small fortune. For some time, she had some difficulties with the hair powder treatment that she had been using to disguise her appearance. To put it simply, it was not the most resilient form of masking when it came to water. However, seeing the beautiful color in front of her, Honoria suddenly got a brilliant idea about dyeing her hair with such a luxurious substance. After all, she was in actuality royalty and had garnered the nickname of Pirate Queen by the enemies of Austria during her tenure as a privateer. Would it not make sense for her to dye her naturally chocolate hair to a deep Tyrian purple? Unlike the other girls, she honestly did not care that Berengar's eye had been gazing upon the massive bosom of the foreign beauty who was in their presence. However, the awkward scene of Berengar's first meeting with the Princess of Granada abruptly came to an end as Emperor Vitranes of the Byzantine Empire made his way through the Great Hall to greet the soon-to-be-crowned King of Austria. After stepping into the fray, The Emperor of Byzantium boldly approached Berengar as a fellow monarch, but more importantly as a man whose realm was deeply in debt to Berengar. Thus he put on a respectful appearance as he greeted Berengar. "King Berengar von Kufstein, I have wanted to meet your acquaintance for some time now. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Emperor Vitranis Palaiologos of the Byzantine." However, the man's words were instantly cut short as he gazed upon the white-haired beauty standing next to Berengar. Though the young woman's hair color was different, and she was more physically mature, there was no mistaking it. This woman was his long-lost daughter, who had until now been believed to be dead. As such, the proud Emperor of the East began to break out into tears as his voice cracked. "Honoria, is that you?" This sudden revelation shocked the court as they gazed over at the white-haired beauty from Byzantium, who they all knew by the moniker of Valeria Zonera, the Pirate Queen of Austria. Honoria's angelic face seemed shocked as she saw her father standing before her. The man did not appear to be vengeful in the slightest as he gazed upon his runaway daughter. Instead, he seemed to be filled with disbelief. As such, she struggled to find the words, fearful that her father would drag her back to Constantinople. Berengar, of course, feigned ignorance to this fact. It was best not to reveal that he knew of Honoria's identity this entire time. As such, he stood by silently with a shocked expression, despite being the architect behind this father-daughter reunion. Berengar had specifically invited the Byzantine emperor for two reasons. One was that the appearance of the Eastern emperor at Berengar's coronation spoke volumes about the legitimacy of his title. Secondly, it was now time to advance his plans with the Byzantine Empire as a long-term ally. After all, Berengar had become aware of Linda's agreement with Andronikos and his mysterious backers. Thus he was not afraid of making his play. After several moments of silence, Honoria rushed over to her father and gave him a big hug. "Father, I did not expect to see you here." The entire Great Hall was silent as they heard this news. Straight from the Pirate Queen's mouth, she had admitted to the fact that she was the runaway Byzantine princess. Vitranis struggled to cope with this news as he grasped a hold of his errant daughter. It took him a few moments to come to his senses before he asked the flurry of questions on his mind. "Are you all right? Why are you here in Kufstein? Did anything happen to you?" After hearing this, Honoria broke away from her father's grasp, where she put on a friendly smile before assuring him that she was okay. "I'm all right, father. Without King Berengar's kindness, I would be dead, or worse by now." Hearing this news snapped Vitranis back to reality, and he instantly made his way over to the Austrian king with a look of fury on his face. "You bastard, you kept my daughter here this entire time, and you did not once notify me that she was alive. Just what are you planning?" However, before Vitranis could take a swing at Berengar, his arm was dragged away by a pleading Honoria. She could instantly tell by the shocked facade that Berengar and the others were putting on that they planned to deny knowing her true identity. As such, she quickly played the part. "You're wrong, father. King Berengar was ignorant of my true identity. I told him I was a noblewoman from Antioch. All he has done is show me kindness." While Honoria played the part well, only one man in the crowd was unconvinced of her charade, and that was a particularly powerful nobleman from the Byzantine Empire. Though Berengar had no way of knowing it, this man was one of the backers of Andronikos. He had journeyed with the emperor to Kufstein to assure that the scheme to place Berengar and Honoria's son on the Byzantine throne went smoothly. As such, he quickly came to Honoria's defense as he approached the enraged emperor. "Your Majesty, I know you are currently conflicted, but think about this rationally. I mean, just look at King Berengar. He seems just as baffled as you are about this whole situation. I suggest we discuss these matters in private after the coronation has ended. After all, you are making a scene." After hearing the advice from his council, Vitranis looked around, where he saw that the entire attention of the Great Hall had been shifted to him and his outburst. As such, the emperor coughed before speaking to Honoria in a more friendly tone. "I expect a proper response from you about what has happened since you foolishly decided to run away and what exactly the nature of the relationship is between you and this man." With that said, the emperor withdrew from Berengar's presence and left the Great Hall. For now, he needed some time to think things through, and the advice of his council would play a role in how he treated this new information. The mysterious nobleman who calmed the emperor's wrath approached Berengar before bowing respectfully. "I apologize for the emperor's behavior. Since Aretha's untimely death, he has been a bit on edge. I hope you can forgive him for his violent outburst on this special day of yours." With that said, Berengar nodded his head in silence while observing the man closely. After seeing the King of Austria's reaction, the mysterious nobleman raised his head before departing. "If you will excuse me, I believe it is my job to counsel the Emperor when he is distressed. I assure you, whatever is the nature of your relationship with our princess, I will ensure that the Emperor accepts it." After saying this, the man followed after the enraged Emperor of Byzantium, leaving Berengar and Honoria in a confused state. Honoria gazed at Berengar with tears forming in her eyes, that began to stream down her perfect ivory cheeks. It was at this moment Berengar realized that he had not informed her of Aretha's demise. With this in mind, the girl choked on her words as she attempted to find out for certain. Aretha's is dead?" In response to this, Berengar grabbed a hold of Honoria and tucked her head into his chest while stroking her silky white hair. As he did so, he apologized to her profusely. "I am so sorry, I thought you knew." As such, Honoria spent the next 30 minutes staining Berengar's luxurious attire with her tears. Throughout this entire time, Berengar comforted the princess on the loss of her godfather. The beginning of the day of his coronation had not gone as planned. Chapter 341, Coronation of a King Part 2. While Emperor Vitranes was calming his nerves in the courtyard of the royal palace of Austria, Berengar was comforting Honoria after she had learned the troubling news of Aretha's death. He latched onto the beautiful young woman like a lamprey as he stroked her silky white hair. While he did so, he whispered into the princess's ear, "Don't worry, everything will be fine. I promise that I will convince your father to allow us to be together." Honoria looked up at Berengar with an appreciative glance. Without Berengar here to comfort her, she had no idea how she would handle the news of Aretha's death. Aside from Heraclius, her godfather was her only friend growing up. Hearing that he had passed away while still being so young shook the girl to her core. It was only after Berengar had helped calm the princess's nerves that the young king addressed the crowd of nobility who had gathered to witness his coronation with a calm and confident tone. "I apologize for the scene just now. We will be moving on to the coronation shortly, so I suggest you take your fill of food and wine before it is no longer being distributed." After saying this, Berengar returned his attention to the people who were gathered by his side. Marquis Otto von Gratz, who was the father of Adela, had also approached Berengar during this time and began to speak to him. "Your Majesty, I have to ask, will everything be all right between you and our allies to the east? It appears that Princess Honoria's presence has now become known to everyone present." Berengar smiled in response to this and nodded his head before addressing his chancellor's concerns. "Everything will be fine, Otto. After my coronation, I intend to have a long discussion with the Byzantine Emperor about the future of our two realms. For now, you should enjoy yourself. The ceremony will begin soon enough." After seeing the confident expression on Berengar's face, Otto felt somewhat relieved. The king knew what he was doing, even if it may not have seemed that way from the initial encounter. As such, he nodded his head and smiled before responding to Berengar's remarks. "I will do as you suggested." With that said, Marquis Otto took his leave and began to mingle with the other guests. Before long, the emperor returned to the event after some thorough convincing from the mysterious nobleman from the east. After doing so, Berengar instructed the food and wine to be taken back to the kitchen, and the ceremony had begun. Ludolf, who was the head of the Reformist Church, held onto a purple pillow with golden embroidery. Upon this pillow was a crown fit for a king. This crown was gold with black garnet gemstones embedded within its surface and contained a black velvet lining. As such, Berengar spoke towards the crowd that had gathered to witness this occasion with an authoritative voice as he said the words that would be etched into history. "I, King Berengar von Kufstein, first of my name hereby declare that I am crowned by God, not by the Church, as my power is divine in nature. It is under his will that no man alive or dead commands me on this great earth, for I answer solely to the Lord God Almighty." After saying this short, but precise speech, Berengar grabbed a hold of the gilded crown and placed it on his head. The moment he did so, Marquis Otto von Gratz, the Chancellor of Austria, ordered every Austrian man, woman, and child present, "Kneel before your king." The moment he said this, the entire crowd gathered, aside from the diplomats of foreign kingdoms, kneeled before Berengar and bowed their heads in respect to the man that would one day lead Austria to boundless glory. When Berengar saw this, A smug smile carved itself upon his flawless face. He had waited years for this day, and it had finally come true. Though the road to the crown was complete, the road to power had only just begun. His ambitions were far more significant than simply being king of Austria and Switzerland. He planned many conquests in the years to come and had already begun to draft the documents necessary to fund expeditions across the world in search of lands with valuable resources ripe for colonization. However, for now, such things were still unachievable. As a matter of principle, he had several tasks at hand that prevented such actions. Firstly, Berengar had to take care of his relations with the empire to the east. Then he would have to marry his darling fiancée and sire some offspring. After that, he would have to begin the process of industrialization. It was not until Berengar had achieved the results he desired that he would fund an expedition to the New World and start his wars of unification. Berengar kept this fact in mind as he spent the rest of the day entertaining his guests, many of which had traveled across Austria and Europe itself to witness the monumental occasion. After spending several hours mingling with the noblemen and women of the Western world, Berengar finally ended the coronation ceremony. After the hundreds of guests had dispersed from his palace, the young monarch took his first steps on his long journey towards unification. As such, Berengar approached the emperor and his council with a pleasant smile on his face. The two men had waited silently until this moment, knowing that there were important matters that needed to be discussed between their two realms. Now that the coronation ceremony was completed, Berengar was required to mend the temporary rift between himself and the Byzantines. As such, he approached the Emperor of the East with a friendly smile before expressing his thoughts. "I apologize for the wait, Emperor Vitranes. I believe that you and I have some important matters to discuss. If you and your friend would follow me to someplace more private, I would very much like to have a conversation with you." The Byzantine emperor eyed Berengar with suspicion. However, the mysterious Byzantine nobleman by his side nodded his head in approval, signaling to the emperor that it would be acceptable to do so. As such, Emperor Vitranes and his council followed Berengar to his study where Honoria was already waiting for their discussion. She had a nervous smile on her otherwise perfect face as she witnessed her lover and father enter the room together. She knew this discussion would seal her fate. Either she could continue to live with Berengar and enjoy the life of a privateer, or she would be dragged back to Constantinople and be forced to marry some prince where she would live her life in servitude. Regardless of the risks, she trusted Berengar with every fiber of his being to properly negotiate with her father about a potential marriage between herself and her lover. It was with this in mind that she greeted her estranged father with a pleasant but forced smile. "Father, it is good to see that you are still in exceptional health." Vitranes did not respond to this and merely snubbed his daughter. Only after the doors were sealed and absolute privacy was ensured did Emperor Vitranes speak his mind about the whole ordeal. "Tell me, King Berengar, how long has my daughter been living with you?" Berengar saw no reason to lie about such a thing, and as such, he quickly revealed the information. "I suppose it has been roughly 2 years now? Maybe longer." Emperor Vitranes nodded his head before speaking his thoughts on the matter. "I must thank you for keeping her safe during this time. However, I am still confused about the nature of your relationship with my daughter. I understand that you already have a fiancé, and your wedding is set not long from now. So tell me, what intentions do you have for my daughter, now that you know she is the princess of the Byzantine Empire?" Berengar smiled when he heard this question. For years now, he had been trying to think of a way to convince the emperor to allow him to marry Honoria as his third wife, and now that the time had come, he refused to let the chance slip from his grasp. As such, he quickly grabbed a hold of Honoria's hand before bringing it to his lips, where he kissed it in an intimate display. After doing so, he revealed his thoughts to the emperor, who was standing in shock. "The fact that Valeria is the missing Princess Honoria does not change how I feel about her. The truth is we are in love and have been for some time. If anything, this presents an opportunity, one that could guarantee the prosperity of our two realms for years to come." Vitranes instantly frowned when he heard this. His worst fears had been realized. Berengar was nothing more than a womanizer who had taken his only daughter as a member of his harem. He had heard rumors that Berengar kept several mistresses by his side, but he never suspected that his daughter was one of them until now. As such, he was naturally inclined to reject any offer that Berengar was about to present. However, before he could refuse to listen to such absurdity, The mysterious nobleman accompanying the Byzantine emperor immediately spoke out with a friendly tone. "Do tell, King Berengar, what kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" After hearing this, a smug smile etched itself upon Berengar's immaculate features as he revealed the plot he had in mind ever since Honoria's arrival in Kufstein. "Well, that is quite simple. I intend to marry Honoria as my third wife. In doing so, I will absolve your empire of all debts that you currently hold to the Austrian crown and establish an alliance between our two realms for the foreseeable future. So tell me, Emperor Vitranis, are you willing to marry your daughter to a German king?" The room was utterly silent as the young monarch spoke these words to the emperor from the east. Berengar's offer was simply outrageous. As such, it took some time for the man to calm his nerves. What came next would be an intense negotiation that would alter the course of the world's history for the foreseeable future. Chapter 342: Aggressive Negotiations with the Byzantine Emperor. Berengar stared down Vitranis with a gaze of utter confidence. The Byzantine emperor was visibly shaking from the rage building up within himself. This minor nobleman from the west who had risen to the status of a king had won his only daughter's heart and most likely taken her virtue with it. This was a massive blow to the prestige of the Byzantine imperial family. After all, Berengar may be the most powerful man in Europe at the moment, but he was still of a lesser pedigree. As such, those who had come from dynasties that had ruled over kingdoms and empires for centuries still tended to look down upon him as nothing more than an upstart. Vitranis was one of these men. Austria may be exceptionally wealthy and hold supreme martial power compared to its neighbors, but it was a rising star. Meanwhile, Constantinople had been the gem of the East since the days of Rome. Such past glories blinded Vitranis with hubris when dealing with this upstart king of the West. Especially when considering this young monarch had just blatantly stated he wanted to take Honoria as his third wife. Vitranis gazed at his errant daughter's flushed appearance as the girl heard Berengar's words, and noticed that Honoria was utterly entranced with the Austrian king. To think that his daughter would fall head over heels for a filthy German was an insult to the emperor's allegedly pure Roman heritage. The German states had come a long way in terms of advancement and civilization since the days of their barbarian ancestors. Despite this, the stigma surrounding the Germans as savage and brutal people never entirely faded from the perspective of the Byzantines. After all, the Greco-Roman population of the Eastern Empire still claimed a lineage to the ancient Romans, or at the very least, the nobility did so. With all of this in mind, the emperor nearly erupted at Berengar and his claims. However, Vitranis choked back his anger and behaved with semi-civil conduct as he addressed Berengar's conditions. "Bah, you think you can marry my daughter as your third wife? I know you may not be Catholic, but surely the German Reformation does not allow polygamy." In response to this, the smug grin on Berengar's face failed to vanish as he boldly addressed the emperor's first point of contention. "The German Reformation and its adherents believe what I tell them to believe. If you were to actually study the Word of God, and go back to the Old Testament, then you would see proof of polygamy as a common practice among the Heavenly Father's most favored children. As for the New Testament, only a few verses mention polygamy, and it is strictly regarding members of the clergy. As for whether or not it is culturally compatible with the German way of life, the ancestors of my people practiced polygamy in a limited capacity. Usually, it was only men of great status who took multiple wives, but we live in different times, and I see no reason a common man cannot take up more than one bride if he can provide for them and his children with them." Vitranis did not know how to refute Berengar's claims when it came to his arguments. He was neither a biblical scholar nor a historian capable of presenting counter-evidence. As such, he merely resorted to childish insults in regards to Berengar's heritage. "Your ancestors were nothing more than filthy barbarians." When Honoria heard this, she frowned before commenting on her father's rude remarks. "Father, how?" However, before she could finish her statement, Berengar smiled cruelly and responded with a witty retort. "And your ancestors were a bunch of wicked degenerates, but I suppose both of our people have come a long way in terms of civilization. I would ask you to refrain from insulting my heritage. After all, soon enough, your grandchildren will share it." Vitranis nearly snapped when he heard the last part of Berengar's remark. However, the mysterious nobleman nearby attempted to calm the emperor's nerves as he whispered in his ear some words that only the two men could hear. After hearing the advice of his minister, Vitranis calmly responded to Berengar's claims with a forced smile on his face. You truly believe that, don't you? The smug grin spread across Berengar's face never faded, as it only increased in size every time he heard the Emperor speak. This did not go unnoticed by his guests, and it only acted as a means to stoke the fire in Vetrani's heart. Berengar did not respond to this question, at least not verbally. He merely nodded his head in silence, knowing that such an action would further provoke the Emperor. His assumptions proved correct, as Vetrani's practically had steam coming out of his ears as he continued to press Berengar on his claims. Tell me, King Berengar, why are you so positive that I will agree to allow you to marry my daughter? In response to this, Berengar raised 4 of his fingers before calmly responding to the Emperor's question. There are 4 reasons why I know for a fact that you will wed your daughter to me. Firstly, now that your alliance with France has faltered due to Honoria's disappearance, you need a powerful ally to the west. I can provide a far more stable alliance than my pathetic neighbor to the west. Secondly, I have already taken your daughter's chastity, which means finding an alternative option for her to marry will be nigh impossible, especially when your other options hear that it is the mighty King Berengar who has taken the girl's first time. Thirdly, you do not have the power to compel me to give her up, and I am more than willing to wage war for her hand in marriage, but of course, that would be my last option, and I would greatly prefer a peacefully alternative. After saying this, silence prevailed in the room. The only sound that could be heard was the grinding of the Emperor's teeth as he struggled to come to terms with Berengar's words. It was only after a few moments where the minister who had accompanied Vetrani's spoke up on the matter. You mentioned 4 reasons for why the Emperor will give in to your demands. What is the final one? In response to this, Berengar's smile finally disappeared as a grave expression appeared across his pristine face. As he did so, an oppressive aura filled the room as Berengar spoke with the authority of a tyrant. Lastly, you owe me a substantial debt, one that would be difficult to pay even with your newly acquired territory. I would be more than happy to forgive a sizable portion of that account in return for the princess's hand in marriage. You can consider it the bride price. When the minister heard this last remark, he knew that Berengar had negotiated his terms masterfully. The young monarch had started with 3 solid, albeit harsh justifications for why he would get his way, only to end with an option that greatly favored the other party. As such, the mysterious minister began to whisper his counsel into the Emperor's ear. A marriage with Honoria greatly favored the minister's faction and was one of their most important goals. He could consider it the fortune of heaven for himself being picked to accompany the Emperor on this journey to Kufstein. As such, he did everything he could to convince the Emperor to accept Berengar's terms, especially since Berengar was using debt-trap diplomacy to seal the deal. The Emperor and his minister conversed in hushed tones for several minutes until they finally returned to the negotiating table, where Berengar and Honoria sat in silence. The Emperor made one final demand before ending the negotiations. It would appear that you have made a convincing argument. My minister seems to support your decision. However, I have a single point of contention that I think needs to be addressed. My daughter is an imperial princess, while your other brides-to-be are far lower ranked in the noble hierarchy. Make my daughter your first wife and the lawful Queen of Austria, and I will accept your demands. The Emperor saw this as a reasonable request and did not expect Berengar to refuse. However, as Berengar had stated, he held all the cards in this negotiation, and he would not relent on the issue. I refuse. Honoria will be my 3rd wife, and that is final. Vetrani's nearly jumped out of his seat as he heard such a brash remark. However, he looked over at his minister's gaze before gritting his teeth and asking politely why Berengar would refuse such a demand. Why, it is a perfectly reasonable request. Berengar merely chuckled as he allowed Honoria to speak for the first time in the negotiation. Ask your daughter how she feels about ruling as the primary queen of Austria. When Vetrani's looked over at Honoria, he was surprised to see she was completely unfazed by Berengar's remarks. As such, Honoria expressed her desires to her father openly and clearly. I have no intention to rule as the High Queen beside Berengar. It is a task I am not suited to. Adela is a far better candidate for such a position. Berengar has given me the freedom to live my life as I see fit, and the affairs of the court are dreadful, to say the least. Before Vetrani's could respond, Berengar opted to inform Vetrani's of the format he had decided to make for his polygamous structure. Your daughter will have the official title of queen, which means she is a secondary wife. There will only be one High Queen of Austria who rules by my side, and that is my fiancée Adela von Gratz. In exchange for this, I offer a matrilineal marriage so that Honoria's children are members of your dynasty. An alliance will be established between our two realms, one that I am sure will last the test of time, and I am willing to absolve you and your empire of 75% of its debt. As for the payment of the remainder 25%, it can be negotiated at a later date. So what do you say? Do you agree to my terms? Vetranes asked Honoria one last question to his only daughter before coming to a decision. Is this really what you want, Honoria? In response to this, Honoria nodded her head with a beautiful smile on her face before answering her father's inquiry. More than anything, the emperor sighed heavily before nodding his head. Very well, I agree to betroth my daughter to you, King Berengar. You have truly left me with no other option. I must say, you truly know how to get what you want. Berengar responded to the emperor's words with a genuine smile on his face. Thank you, Emperor Vetranes, or should I call you father-in-law? However, Vetranes shook his head and stood up when he heard this. He said one final word before departing the room. That wasn't meant to be a compliment. After saying this, Vetranes left his daughter and her new fiancé alone in the room. He had a massive headache after the aggressive negotiations he had just dealt with. As for Berengar, he immediately began to make out with Honoria after her father left. What the two would get up to while alone in the royal palace's study only they would know. Chapter 343 discussing military intervention in Granada. After successfully negotiating his future marriage to Honoria, Berengar returned to the great hall of his royal palace, where another guest was sitting and drinking, surrounded by his two wives and his beautiful sister. This guest was none other than Sultan Hassan al-Fadl. Though nearly all of the guests had long since vanished from the scene, Hassan had stayed behind to ask a favor of Berengar. When Berengar saw the man sitting next to the three beauties, he decided to sit alongside them. As he did so, Hassan made a toast in Berengar's honor. To King Berengar, long may he reign. Berengar smiled as he heard this and took a sip from the chalice filled with the fortified wine. After doing so, he gazed over at Yasmin, who he could tell was an astounding beauty. Berengar decided to check out the young woman and was highly impressed with the Moorish princess's divine physique. However, before Berengar could finish inspecting the woman, he heard Hassan's voice call out to him. So, you are interested in my sister after all? Berengar snapped back to attention after hearing this and sighed before responding. I'd be lying if I said she was not beautiful. However, I have enough women at the moment, and I'm pretty sure they will castrate me in my sleep if I were to take in another. When Berengar said this, Yasmin looked at him with a sad glance. She had grown quite fond of Berengar during her brief stay in Kufstein, even though they had rarely communicated. Berengar's exquisite appearance and natural charisma had taken a hold of the girl's affections. Despite Berengar's words, Hassan remained undeterred and made one final remark. I am certain you will come around to the idea sooner or later. After saying this, he glanced over at his sister and his wives before commenting. Girls, if you will excuse us, I have some important matters to discuss with my friend. After saying this, Yasmin nodded and led her little brother's wives from the scene. After the women disappeared, Hassan looked around to ensure that he and Berengar were truly alone. It was only after he confirmed such a thing did his confident facade begin to crack. Berengar, I need your help. The war with the Iberian Union is not going as planned. They have defeated my armies on multiple occasions and captured many of the weapons you have sold me. They have already retaken the land I have seized in this conflict and have begun to push into the heart of my kingdom. You said in our alliance that you would guarantee our independence. I have come to ask for you to honor your words. Berengar took a sip from his chalice before sighing heavily. He had just finished a war and did not want to engage in another. Though he did not desire to go to war so quickly after returning home, certain events were unavoidable. Thus Berengar began to hatch a plan, one where he could utilize General Arnulf to oversee the war effort in his stead. If things still did not turn out well, only then would he take up the mantle. With this in mind, Berengar tapped the armrest on the sofa thrice before responding to Hassan's remarks. How the hell did you manage to fuck up this badly? I gave you arms, training, and advisors, and you still could not lead your men to victory? Hassan had a downcast expression as he stared at the ground, too afraid to look Berengar in the eye. Noticing his ally's behavior, Berengar sighed once more before speaking up on the matter. I suppose I should not be too hard on you." As soon as Berengar said this, Hassan looked up at him with surprise on his face. However, Berengar ignored this and continued his train of thought. "Truthfully, even with the advantages I have given you, I did not believe you would win this conflict by yourself. There are too many factors working against you. You are vastly outnumbered by your enemies and surrounded by the south. You lack the means to produce the arms and munitions that your army is equipped with and thus rely heavily on imports to sustain your military. You also lack the means to conscript a large number of forces without it adversely affecting your economy. I knew this day would come. I just did not expect it to be so soon. All right, I will send 10,000 men from my army to intervene on your behalf. However, I will need a few months to field them. We have just gotten out of our war for independence, and my army needs time to lick their wounds. I assume you can hold out for half a year. After all, it takes the Iberians a couple of months to successfully siege a single castle, let alone a city. If you can last 6 months, I promise you my armies will ensure your victory in this conflict. Who knows, we might even see a restoration of Al-Andalus." Hassan knew it would take some time for Berengar to deploy his forces, but he did not expect half a year. Nevertheless, the young sultan knew there was no chance of convincing Berengar to send his troops early. After all, the reputation of the Austrian king was one of overwhelming dominance. With this in mind, he sighed once more before responding to Berengar's remarks. "Very well, I will hold the line until your forces can appear. I hope your army does not arrive too late." When Berengar heard this remark, he smiled and grasped a hold of Hassan's shoulder before comforting the man. "Do not worry, my friend, by the time my forces arrive in Granada, not even an army of 100,000 men will be able to defeat our alliance." Hassan had little faith in Berengar's bold claims, but he knew that Berengar's army tended to annihilate any hostile force they came across. As such, he was not entirely without hope. Little did he know of Berengar's newest weapons, nor the weapons he planned to build during the allotted timeframe. The age of industry would soon be upon Austria, and Berengar planned to upgrade his artillery within the next few months. The needle rifle itself was a massive advantage over his enemies, but Berengar needed rifled breech loaders. As such, Berengar planned to use the next 6 months to industrialize as much of his kingdom as he could while mass equipping his army with the new weapons and tactics needed to annihilate his enemies. With this in mind, Berengar finished his wine before placing the chalice on the table. As he did so, he gave the Moorish Sultan a bit of friendly advice before departing. "Have faith, my friend. You have chosen your friends wisely. Now is the time to put some trust into our alliance. Before long, the Catholic Church and its minions will crumble beneath our feet. Their days of supremacy are coming to an end. A new world awaits on the horizon, and we will stand at the top of it." After saying this, Berengar departed from the room, leaving Hassan to drink by himself. He had much to think about. If what Berengar said was true, he may be a powerful monarch within the Iberian Peninsula one day, not just a minor player. The very idea that Al-Andalus could see a resurgence brought a bitter smile to the man's face as he drank from his cup of wine. After a while, his sister returned, where she began to inquire about the contents of his meeting with the King of Austria. She noticed the complicated expression on her brother's face and dragged his head into her mighty bust, where she proceeded to stroke Hassan's chocolate hair while comforting him. "That bad, huh?" Hassan continued to drink from his chalice before responding to his older sister. "He wants us to hold on for 6 more months. After that, he will send an army to intervene on our behalf. I don't know if he wants us to be desperate and sink more money into his weapons trade, thus increasing our debt to him, or if he genuinely needs the 6 months to prepare his forces." Yasmin thought about the complexity of the topic for several moments before responding to her little brother. He just got out of a war for independence. His troops are likely weary of battle and need time to rest. He also needs to manufacture new munitions for his army. I heard about what he did to Florence. They say he bombarded the city for 2 months, launching hundreds of thousands of shells onto the town, leaving it entirely in ruin. I don't know about you, but that requires a lot of firepower. His artillery is probably drained of resources and needs to recover. He is only asking for 6 months to prepare for intervention into our conflict, which means he must be confident in his manufacturing capabilities. Have faith, brother, we will win this war. After hearing his sister's words of wisdom, Hassan thanked her before departing. He and his family were provided rooms within the royal palace during their stay in Kufstein. As such, he dusted himself off and returned to his room, where he began to sleep.